Hi, welcome back guys. This is your friend, the D and WhatIf, with another fanfiction. This is the second part of what if Deku's mental health issues were treated somewhat realistically. All credits for this video go to their respective authors, so please support the real author. Check out the link in the description for more details. Please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. Izuku was running back to the beach after dropping off a load of trash at his apartment complex when a loud boom shook the street. Izuku didn't stumble or fall like many of the civilians around him. The training he and Aizawa had been doing for the last month shone through in the way that he quickly recovered from the shaking. Izuku excitedly looked around for the source of the earthquake before he caught himself. He hadn't analyzed a hero fight since before. He hadn't indulged this particular bad habit for a long time. His fingers itched to pull out his pencil and run toward the alley that he knew would take him to the source of the noise. But he'd left his backpack inside of an old refrigerator surrounded by other appliances that he'd drug up onto the concrete walkway that bordered Takoba Beach for Asami to pick up the next day. He and Asami hadn't managed to see each other since that first time she came to pick up scrap metal. Izuku had just been too busy with training and school, and Asami was too busy doing her job as a junkyard owner. They kept just barely missing each other. If Izuku was free Monday morning to clean, then Asami was free Monday afternoon when he was supposed to practice walking the circle. If Asami was free Wednesday at noon, then Izuku was back in school taking a test. Instead of meeting in person like they did that first time, Asami just brought one of her friends to help her load up all of the increasingly heavy junk that Izuku cleared from the coastline. He still had a long way to go, but Izuku had built up enough muscle to move heavier things without dying from the strain. He felt like he was finally making a dent. Alongside that and Aizawa's training and helping Mei, Izuku felt like he was finally being helpful. Izuku shook his head and started running toward his destination again when another rumble sent him into a forward roll to avoid hitting the pavement face first. He helped an old man gather his lost groceries and a teenager stand up from their collapsed position on the ground before his curiosity got the better of him and he jogged toward the alley. On the other side there was a crowd gathered. Izuku maneuvered through the crowd, slipping around elbows and ducking under handbags until he was near the front. He could only just stop his mouth from dropping in shock at the sight that waited for him. Izuku had wrongly assumed that the rumbling of the ground was caused by a villain. But when he got to the front of the crowd, he saw that this was not the case. Death Arm's fist slammed into the ground where Suicide Pill had been standing just moments before. Izuku blanched and widened his stance so that the mini-earthquake that followed Death Arm's attempted capture. The strength of the aftershocks seemed to suggest that he was using his full strength, despite the crowded area and the possibility that that could kill the villain. Suicide Pill was laughing, one neon-covered hand positioned over his mouth like he was trying to muffle the sound, when in fact he was making a show of the way his shoulders moved up and down. "What's wrong, hero?" Suicide Pill called across the distance between them. "Are you having trouble over there?" Death Arms didn't dignify the villain's taunt with a response and just charged forward again. Izuku watched. Death Arms wasn't really built for speed. He did best in close combat scenarios where he could use his strong arms with finesse. The long battle that Suicide Pill was baiting him into wasn't going to end well for him if he didn't have backup. Suicide Pill got out of the way of Death Arms' charge with a back handspring. The neon villain landed daintily on his feet and was bringing a hand up to his mouth to throw a tooth maybe. Would Izuku's suspicions be confirmed? When a brown tendril wrapped around his wrist and pulled the villain off balance, Suicide Pill rolled with the momentum, managing to land on his feet again, but his hand was still tethered to the ground. Izuku's eyes eagerly tracked the wooden appendage to Kamui Wood's form. The arboreal hero was balanced on top of a street light. Death Arms took the opportunity for what it was and charged again. With Kamui Woods keeping the villain stationary, Death Arms was able to punch him in the head before he danced out of the way. Suicide Pill went down easy. As soon as Death Arms' fist made contact with his head, it was easy to tell that the whole ordeal was over. Izuku marveled at Death Arms' control. Where before he had let his fists crash into the ground with astronomical levels of power, now he made sure to slow his punch just before it made contact so that the hero didn't literally pulverize the villain's skull. Not that Suicide Pill wouldn't deserve it, but the amount of precision involved in that was amazing. Izuku wondered if that kind of thing took energy, because if so, Izuku could understand why Death Arms let his blows collide with the street. If not though, that was a lot of unnecessary damage. There were at least 3 potholes in the street because of Death Arms' botched attempts to nab the villain. It probably took a lot of muscle control at the very least, and that might cause strain that Death Arms didn't think he could risk when pursuing an SK villain of Suicide Pill's caliber. It was odd that Suicide Pill had been out during the day like this, Izuku thought. All of the police and hero altercations that he had read about occurred at nighttime. Had Suicide Pill suddenly devolved and made a fatal mistake? Or was it just a wrong place, wrong time scenario? Izuku muttered under his breath as he watched Death Arms and Kamui Woods talk over the collapsed villain. Kamui Woods crouched to put a pair of wooden handcuffs on him. Izuku was so lucky to get to see Kamui Woods in person. He should really take this opportunity to sketch out his hero costume. Izuku's hands reached for the non-existent backpack straps on his shoulders, and he cursed himself for leaving his backpack behind. He and Aizawa-sensei had been working on some observation exercises. Maybe he'd be able to remember. Or he could take a picture. Izuku's hands slapped at his pockets for his phone. With the action over, most people had dispersed back out across the street and into shops. Izuku fell back as well. From the mouth of the alley, he managed to get a few good pictures of Kamui Woods and Death Arms standing over the knocked-out suicide pill. He desperately wanted to go and ask for their autographs, but he didn't have anything for them to sign, and he wouldn't want to bother them when they were dealing with serious business anyway. By now the police had arrived, and Kamui Woods removed his makeshift wooden handcuffs for a pair of quirk-suppressing ones. Izuku recognized the officers from his more active hero-chasing days. Masutafu only had so many police officers, and at some point Izuku had memorized the ones he saw most often. There was the one with a cat face, the plain-looking detective, and the girl who always wore red lipstick, who was usually partnered with the one who had antlers. They were who Izuku saw the most back then. Of course, they wouldn't be able to recognize him if they were held at gunpoint. Izuku had, from the start, ensured he stayed in the shadows for hero fights, half out of anxiety and half out of respect for the self-preservation his mother assumed he had. Izuku scanned the crowd for someone else he used to see at hero fights. And there he was. Kaken stood in the mouth of an alley on the opposite side of the street. He had an intense look in his eyes, clearly trying to memorize the strategy that Kamui Woods and Death Arms had thrown together so seamlessly. It was Kaken's presence that finally spurred Izuku to head back toward the beach. He didn't want to see the victory in Kaken's expression if he noticed that Izuku was there. He knew exactly the expression that Kaken's face would contort into. The slight raising of his eyebrows, the shallow baring of teeth, the way his nose scrunched up like he had smelled something bad. The look said, "I'm right as always and you're wrong again." That look would make Izuku feel like he was back in elementary school. That look that would make Izuku feel like he was stupid for even considering trying to be a hero after his spectacular fuck-up. That look would land on Izuku's exposed arms, and Izuku would probably have to sprint away from Kaken's angry explosions while his childhood friend shouted at him about fruitless efforts. Izuku had changed a lot since that day in the classroom where Kaken called out his progress. He dreaded the day that he had to face Kaken without his boxy school uniform on because the Gakurin hit a lot, and Kaken hated when Izuku lied to him. He always had, even when they were little, even after they weren't exactly friends anymore, even now. Izuku got back to the beach without becoming winded. He stretched out his legs while he swiped through the photos he had taken. He grabbed one foot and held it behind his back before moving on to the other. He had a lot of good shots of Kamui Woods from the left side that his rose belt laid on, but almost none from the right. Izuku set his phone in the sand while touching his toes, counting to 20 with his palms flat on the ground. It was hard to imagine that he had struggled to do this only a month ago. Izuku posted the photos on the Kamui Woods Reddit before he went back to work. Kamui Woods, despite being a fairly new hero, had a deeply dedicated fan base. His Reddit page was on par with All Might's with the amount of traffic it got. Izuku was almost scared that if he had the photos on his phone and didn't post them, that a Kamui Woods fangirl would hunt him down and kill him for his selfishness. Izuku straightened up from his stretch and slipped his phone back into his pocket. His eyes tracked the good fourth of the beach that he had managed to clear. 25% through. Izuku bit his lip. That was barely anything. He got back to work. Page 86 of Hero Analysis for the Future number 13. Kamui Woods has changed the general shape of his knee pads. They now extend further down his shin, I assume to act as shin guards and knee pads at once. I wonder how they function when he's in more curled positions. Would the part that goes down his legs stick out, or can he manipulate the wood to curve with his body? I'm almost certain that he also changed the color of his bodysuit. It seems more blue, whereas before it was kind of purple toned. It meshes with the color of his rose garland a lot better. Kamui Woods has added some embellishments to his shoes. I cannot think of a purpose behind these, and I think they look stupid, so hopefully these are cut the next time he makes an update to his costume. I think that's all of the changes. I may have missed some renditions of Kamui Woods' costumes because I have been distracted these last few months. I'm a bit ashamed that I haven't been keeping up with my hero analysis. I was just so focused on killing myself that I didn't see the point in it, and now Aizawa is having me analyze villains as my homework instead of heroes, so I guess I just forgot about it. Katsumi and I have been talking about costumes a lot lately though, so I felt like I owed it to her to stay informed. The last few pages of this are just stuff that I sketched out for her. I've been treating this notebook more as a diary than an analysis journal lately. It makes me feel stupid, but at the same time, I feel like it's better to put all my thoughts here instead of anywhere else. Mom knows about what I did now. Aizawa said that it was necessary. From an objective standpoint, I can understand that. If I were him and a kid was suicidal and I had an opportunity to tell their guardian, I would do it. I guess that's why I can't be mad. That, and Mom is taking the whole thing surprisingly well. I don't have the right to be mad about it when they're such great people. They're both being so gentle and caring, and I don't deserve them. I don't deserve Aizawa helping me train. I don't deserve Mom's consideration or kindness. I don't deserve Hatsume's texts and offers to hang out. I don't deserve Asami's help taking things to her junkyard. I've been lying for a long time about a lot of things, but I didn't mean to fool them like this. I'm going to let them all down. He wrote his journal entry on Kamui Woods, and he felt normal for a whole 2 seconds before he decided to update a few of his other entries. He thumbed through his journal. The singed edges made it easy to distinguish each page from the next. He was looking for his entry on Gang Orca. One hand flipped through the pages and the other brought up the Gang Orca Reddit. He had just found the right section when his hand slipped, losing all of the pages bunched together in his hand. The journal naturally opened to a page near the middle, a page that just happened to have half All Might's signature across it. Izuku's attention, previously split between his journal and the newest posts about Gang Orca's work saving passengers on a sinking cruise ship, honed in on the signature immediately. He felt himself stiffen up reflexively and then forced himself to relax because, come on, it's just an autograph. But the damage had been done and he spiraled into filling an entire page with his inner thoughts, and when he ran out of space he stared at the pencil that he had to sharpen twice during his rant and set it to the side. He crawled onto his bed and shoved his hands under his pillow so that he could hold it to his face while he let the written rant come to its natural conclusion within the confines of his mind. He felt hot and cold at the same time. He felt like a cheater, a liar, and a fake. They were going to realize that he wasn't what he had convinced them he was. He wasn't hero material. He wasn't a good son. He wasn't a genius assistant. He wasn't the nice young boy who gave Asami good scrap. He was and would always be a Deku. A useless, selfish Deku who had to lie to everyone around him to get them to like him. Kaken and All Might had seen through him. Kaken knows him, has known him since kindergarten. How could he be wrong? He had watched Izuku grow up. And like a seer he had predicted how rotten Izuku world turned out to be. Even before the official diagnosis, Kaken watched him when they had playdates. His crimson gaze too keen for a 5-year-old. The thing about Bakugo Katsuki was that he was brilliant. He was smart, he was talented, and he had an amazing quirk. He was the most favorable outcome of all the factors that went into creating him. Bakugo Mitsuki's quirk gave her the ability to secrete glycerin from her skin. Bakugo Masaru's quirk changed the chemical composition of the sweat produced from his hands into a non-corrosive acid with combustive properties, so that if he rubbed his hands together, he could create explosions. Those two quirks could have combined in a multitude of different ways. Kaken could have gotten the ability to make soap, or produce acid, or secrete a mucus that could be used as an explosive when ignited, or the nitroglycerin in his system could have resulted in Kaken having some bizarre form of methemoglobinemia. He could have had a quirk that wasn't flashy and eye-catching and wondrous, but he didn't. Bakugo Katsuki had come into the world already winning. The genetic lottery gave him crimson eyes, a powerful quirk, and golden hair, appropriate for the striking son of a former model-turned-fashion designer, appropriate for the future #1 hero. Izuku knew the Bakugo story by heart, told to him over family dinners where Mitsuki ruffled Izuku's hair and Kaken fake gagged from across the table. Mitsuki delighted in telling the story, that she met Masaru Bakugo and was instantly in love, that Mitsuki was working as the model for a line of dresses that Masaru had designed, that she loved his designs and she loved his kind nature when they met in person and discussed the details of the shoot, that Mitsuki hit on Masaru aggressively and forced him to say yes to a date, that after a long time of chasing him, they eventually got married and had their prodigal son. It was a beautiful story. The Bakugos were clearly in love, and despite her brash nature, Mitsuki cared greatly for her son. It was, perhaps, the complete opposite of Izuku's life story. Midoriya and Ko met a man during one of her first cases. She defended him in court and he was mystified by her presence in the courtroom. He pursued her. They got married and he took her name. They had a son who the man only met once or twice, then he lost interest and left in Ko. If Kaken was the winner of the genetic lottery, then Izuku was the loser. Both of his parents had quirks. His parents' parents had quirks. His parents' parents' parents had quirks, and so on. It was statistically improbable that a child of 4th-generation quirk uses would end up without one. And yet he had. Izuku didn't have a quirk. He was lucky to inherit his mother's hair and eye color. He couldn't bear it if he looked like someone he couldn't remember meeting. Someone who had caused his mother a substantial amount of pain. The only traits he got from his father were his curls, hard to manage and unruly at the best of times, and the freckles that littered his body. When Izuku was in the deepest spirals of his anxiety, the farthest depths of his self-loathing, he would wonder about freckles. Some people loved them, they thought they were cute. Others thought that they were ugly, a sign of impurity, dirt sprinkled over otherwise clear skin. a signal that someone wasn't the best that could be produced, a warning sign from the universe in the form of uneven blotches that said stay back. This one isn't right. Izuku wasn't very fond of his freckles. He didn't really like what he looked like, period. But his least favorite thing had to be the freckles. Inherited from an unfaithful husband and absent father, they stained his skin in a brazen declaration of his flaws. From what his mother told him and from one photograph of his father that has since been thrown out, Izuku knew that his father's freckles had not been nearly as dark nor as numerous as his were. They spanned across Izuku's entire complexion, uneven and strange. Izuku pressed his face harder into the pillow. He flexed his toes and dug his fingers into his pillowcase. That was dramatic. The point was that there was a large gap between him and Kaken, and it was a gap that Kaken stood on the other side of and looked down at him from. Bakugo Katsuki was perfect. That's what Izuku used to think. Perfect quirk, perfect family, perfect looks, perfect grades, perfect life. He was full to bursting of potential and determination and had a righteous competitive nature that propelled him through life. He had since learned that Kaken had flaws. The first being that he was mean. Izuku hadn't really thought about it before. People seemed to adore him at school. He had originally thought that the way his childhood friend treated him was completely normal. Izuku really didn't have many other relationships to compare it to, after all. Insults and shoves and later burns and glares had just felt normal until Kaken had stopped all of the kindness that he used to give Izuku when no one else was around. Maybe his scarlet eyes colored Kaken's view of the world in a sheen of bloody red anger. That seemed like a reasonable answer for the disdain that Kaken seemed to have for the general population and for Izuku in particular. Kaken did not have friends. He did not have equals. He had lakeys. Izuku was the lowest of the low, and his presence alone must look like an insult with Kaken's red-stained conjunctive. Just pray that you'll be born with a quirk in your next life and take a swan dive off the roof of the building. Yes, Kaken was cruel. He also thought that everything was about him. Izuku recalled their confrontation in the classroom. Kaken's searing hand on his shoulder. The feel of phantom spit on his cheek. When we were kids, all you talked about was how you would never fucking give up. Never stop trying. How you would catch up with me. And now you're just forfeiting the fucking race. Why the hell are you bulking up if not to beat me? Huh. Izuku rolled onto his side. The cool air hit his face and he took a deep breath to fill his lungs. He slid his hands out from under the pillow and held them in front of his face to shield his eyes from the light and from the cold. His hands were pleasantly warm against his cheek. It was almost justified, though, wasn't it? Kaken had gotten lucky, yes, but he was also just good at what he decided he wanted to be good at, and people loved that. It was like when a cute dog did a particularly impressive trick. Not that Kaken was a dog. No, not at all. It was just that whenever he did anything, that behavior was rewarded by the people around him. Even if his mother told him to not be too rough with the other kids at the playground, the dazzled adults would insist the opposite. They had their own rose-colored glasses on. Ones that obscured the truth of a misbehaving little boy with the vision of a future pro hero. Izuku had the same pair on for a long time, right up until they were shattered on the edge of a suicide bait. Kaken was not naturally cruel or cocky. He was rash and driven, and back then he was young and impressionable. Positive reinforcement was a powerful tool of transformation. Slowly, over the course of years and years, Kaken's guilt over things that as a child made his toes curl diminished. Bullying someone was barely a blip on Kaken's moral radar, but that didn't mean that he didn't feel moral outrage for people that were hurt by villains. It was just that Kaken was not a villain. The world had ensured that he would never think that. And that wasn't Kaken's fault. Izuku twisted onto his other side so that he faced the wall. He curled his knees up to his chest. But even if all of the things that had shaped Bakugo Katsuki hadn't been there, if he wasn't gorgeous, if he didn't have a phenomenal quirk, if he hadn't been born into a loving and stable family, Izuku still had no doubt that Kaken would turn down the same road. He wanted to be the best, he wanted to win, and he wanted people to see him do it. Kaken was driven and smart and good. He wasn't like Izuku. He didn't lie so often that it had become second nature. He didn't jump off a building and guilt a pro hero into taking pity on him. He wasn't. It had taken Izuku a long time to realize this, but they were not the same. Izuku wasn't doing anything that he was doing because of Kaken. He had dropped out of their childhood race ages ago. He was running a new one now, and he was doing it for Aizawa and Inko and Hatsu. He was trying to be happier for them because they deserved Izuku at his best, not the lying, pathetic creature he was now. Even if he couldn't actually be happier or better or stronger, he could at least look like he was, just until he could figure out how to do it for real. He knew it was wrong to feel this way when things had already gotten so much better. He had a friend. His mother was trying to support his interests. Aizawa saw potential in him. But the feeling of uselessness and hopelessness and loneliness still prevailed. He knew that he had no right to feel that way. He had already gained so much he shouldn't ask for more. He should be happy. And sometimes he was. When Aizawa corrected his form by tugging at him with his capture scarf while talking about his husband, Izuku could feel the joy starting to flow up from some long-forgotten place inside him. When his mom waved him off to go to his training sessions with a smile on her face, he smiled back genuinely. When Hatsune demanded that he FaceTime her so that she could show him her progress on one of her babies, he would get excited. The rush of adrenaline that didn't come from fear or panic but from anticipation for her antics make him giddy. It was just that. When he was alone, all of that bright, hopeful stuff would seem fake. Like they were all actors in a play that Izuku was attending, and as soon as he exited the theater, a torrent of rain waited just beyond the glass doors. Even when they were together, sometimes Izuku would get a feeling of dread that forced him to subtly look around for a leak in the roof that wasn't supposed to be there. He was supposed to be happy, so he would be. Inko was reading on the computer when she heard Izuku move through the hallway toward the door. She tilted her head to listen carefully. That was Izuku trying to be quiet while he walked past her door. And that was him sitting down to tie his shoes. Inko got up and hurried to her door, but when her fingers touched the doorknob, they slid off of the metal. She had meant to pull the door open, but now her hand hung limply at her side. Inko looked back over at her computer screen. The pie charts and bar graphs that displayed quirkless suicide rates and unemployment statistics stared back at her in ironically bright colors. She opened the door. "Sweetheart," Inko called hesitantly down the hallway. She watched as Izuku turned to look at her, surprise opening his features. "Hey Mom," he said, "why are you up so early?" Oh, Inko reflected on the fact that she hadn't gone to sleep Friday night. "No reason, baby. I was wondering if I could come with you today, though. I'm curious about this whole cleaning an entire beach by yourself thing." She fluttered her hands around the air to show her excitement. "I want to see your process." Inko felt a nervous smile flicker across her face. Izuku started to respond automatically. "I'm not sure. It's hot outside and I'm walking and it's kind of far away. I don't know if you would want to come all that way to see it when I haven't even gotten that much done." Inko rocked back and forth on her heels. She tugged on the bottom of her shirt and ran her fingertips over the hem. "Sweetheart, I want to see what you're up to, you know. You can take it easy for today, can't you? It'll be a nice walk." Her nervous smile returned tenfold. Izuku turned away from her and finished tying his shoes. Inko watched the zippers on Izuku's backpack move as he shifted his shoulders. There used to be keychains there. Izuku stood up and then twisted around to face her. "If you're sure you want to come, that's okay with me." He mirrored her smile perfectly. "Yeah." Inko clapped her hands in mock excitement to mask the relief she felt. Flats probably weren't appropriate for going to the beach, but she slid them on anyway. She wanted to leave before Izuku got nervous and changed his mind. She started pushing him toward the door. Come on. If we get there quickly enough, I might get to see the sunrise." The morning air was crisp and clean. As Izuku and Inko took the long way to the shore, the scent of the air got salty and then metallic and then a little bit rank as they arrived. Inko hadn't been to Takoba in years. She had heard about the state of it from Mitsuki, but she couldn't have imagined the amount of garbage there. So much that piles and pillars had formed out of the stuff, rising high above the horizon line. Izuku got straight to work. Inko watched as he pulled a trash bag out of his backpack and started to pick up small scattered pieces of debris. Inko settled down on the sea wall next to where Izuku had put his backpack. The way that her feet didn't touch the sand below her made Inko feel like a child again. She swung her feet back and forth in the cool morning air. When she was Izuku's age, she would never have been out this early in the morning on a weekend. Neither would his father. She had to wonder where he got it from. The drive that made it so easy for her baby to do something like this all by himself. The beach was such a long strip of sand it would be easy to look at it and think that nothing had changed. But from where she was sitting to right in front of the stairs, their clear shot to the sea, Izuku had already managed to clear 1/4 of the beach without her getting even a whiff of the effect such efforts should be having on him. They had gotten there early enough to watch the sunrise. By the time the vibrant oranges and pinks were painting the sky, Izuku had filled 2 more bags and settled them down next to the exit. Inko was split between looking at the beautiful sunrise and watching Izuku push a washing machine toward the stairs. On one hand, it was a truly gorgeous sunrise. What was visible of the water glittered in the sunlight, and the clouds formed a gentle frame for the colors being projected across the sky. On the other hand, Izuku was pushing a washing machine across a semi-long stretch of beach toward stairs that he presumably intended to push it up, and he wasn't struggling at all. Inko made a valiant effort to hide her shock, but she was sure that if Izuku glanced at her for even a moment, he would see her eyes bugging out of her head. She knew that he and Aizawa had been training, and that part of that was building muscle, but the last time she had seen Izuku try to lift something heavy had been when he offered to carry a bag of cat litter up the stairs for their elderly neighbor. His twig arms shook, and Inko had to stifle a laugh when the bag was brought up because it was so large that he couldn't see around it. He had struggled then, but now he could probably carry 3 bags easily. As the sky got progressively bluer, Inko felt her exhaustion catch up to her. She brought a hand up to her eye and rubbed at it, trying to convince her eyelids to stay open. Izuku was rolling a tire up the stairs. God, he was so strong now. Inko caught herself. He had always been strong. After that first night that he came home from Aizawa's lesson with a cut on his cheek, The cut had faded over these past weeks until it wasn't the at all anymore. It made Inko wonder how many other wounds Izuku had managed to hide from her until they faded. After that, Izuku had sporadically started opening up to her in casual conversation. He would slip in a tidbit about how he didn't really have any friends besides the pink-haired girl that was constantly calling him, about how he had some scars from things that bullies had done, about how his teachers didn't particularly care for him. Every time Inko had to fight to keep her expression level, he was trusting her with these details because she hadn't made a big deal out of his attempt. It was something that Aizawa had warned her against when she called him the next day about Izuku's face. He didn't want Inko to be negatively affected by his troubles. He had masks and defenses and walls up. Not because he was ashamed of being bullied, but because he didn't want what he was going through to be bad for anybody else. If Inko was too transparent about how every detail he revealed put another crack in her aching heart, then he would try and pretend that he was fine. And, most likely, convince her. The biggest revelation that Inko had about her son was that he was a very adept liar. It was hard to let it go. People were hurting her son, her world, and they weren't being punished for it. But Izuku had insisted that he didn't want to make a fuss. He only had around 5 months of school left and he would rather just leave it all behind him. She had to trust that he could handle it. As she picked herself off from the seawall, Izuku jogged over to her and took a sip of water from the sports bottle in his backpack. "Are you heading out?" Izuku asked. He dragged a hand over his forehead to wipe away some sweat. "I think so, baby," Inko answered. "You should take a break at lunchtime and come home. I'll make you something to eat." After she took a nap. "Okay," Izuku said. He started to head back to the mountains of trash. Inko spoke without thinking. "I'm really proud of you, sweetheart." Izuku blinked at her, like he couldn't think of anything that she would be proud of him for. Inko swallowed. "You've done such a good job of cleaning so far, and I know you've been working really hard with Aizawa-san. I just want you to know that I'm proud of you. I know you're working really hard." Izuku's eyes searched her face. Then he gave her that perfect mirror of her own nervous smile. "Thanks, Mom." "Hey, Mom." Izuku called out to the living room that night. He stood in the entryway. He had changed out of the clothes that he wore to clean the beach, and he was wearing an oversized t-shirt for his sleep clothes. "Yes, sweetheart," Inko replied. "I'm fine now," Izuku told her. "You don't have to worry about me anymore. I'm fine now." Inko's eyebrows slowly fell into a crunched and dubious expression. Izuku kept talking. I know that Aizawa-sensei told you about me trying to kill myself, and I'm fine now. And the bullies and stuff, I've been handling that since for forever, and you don't have to worry. Is all. I'm fine now. I don't want to Aizawa-sensei and Hatsume-sen are really Inko listened as Izuku tried to explain. She also did not believe him. Maybe he thought he was fine now. Or maybe he had taken her declaration of pride as a sign that he had slipped up, and he thought that she had to tell him to prevent him from spiraling again. Maybe he had sat in his room and had some grand epiphany about how he wasn't the most hated person in the world. Or maybe he had decided on the opposite and didn't want her to be suspicious anymore. Maybe. She was so new to this. It was still so hard to read her own son and tell what he was thinking. But she couldn't look at her son, with his timid posture and his shaking hands and his empty room, and believe that he was fine now. "Baby," Inko interrupted her son, setting her phone and the article she was reading on it down. "You don't have to be okay just because you have friends now. You're allowed to still feel sad and suicidal, even now that you have a support system. Aizawa and Mei aren't going to instantly take away what I am now realizing is years and years of everyone telling you that you can't do what you want to do." Inko held up her phone. "I'm reading up on it, you know. Quirkless struggles, and in this kind of constant abuse," she spat the word out of her mouth like it was sour. "It isn't something that will just go away overnight." Her son blinked at her. The way he stood in the mouth of the hallway made him look small. Even with all the muscle he had gained in the last few months, the way the darkness of the shadowed hallway crowded around him made him look like her baby again. Small and defenseless, but that wasn't what he was. He wasn't defenseless. He was just as capable as anyone else, just as vulnerable as anyone else. She repeated this to herself. He wasn't her baby, he was a 14-year-old who was training to become a hero. Inko hated that she was one of the people who had told Izuku he could never accomplish his one true desire. Inko knew it was his one true desire because even as he was standing on the edge of life and death, it was Aizawa's offer to train him that truly drew him back in. She knew it because Izuku had yet to decorate his room with anything else after taking down the monument to his hero that used to stand there. Inko wished, within the deepest depths of her soul, that she had not told him that she was sorry that day so long ago. She remembered the look on his face, the tears that were gathered in his big green eyes like he already knew the answer to his question. The way his tiny voice had shook when he asked if he could still be a hero. She had taken one look at that face and she had failed as a mother for the first time, and not the last time. She had let her own emotions get the best of her, and she had, in that moment, completely forgotten about what Izuku would need to hear. When she told him that she was sorry, she wasn't really saying it to him, she was saying it to herself. Izuku didn't want to hear "I'm sorry" in response to that question. He had wanted to hear her say yes. The fact of the matter is, Inko hadn't heard him ask, "Can I still be a hero?" She had heard him ask, "Mommy, why didn't you give me a quirk?" It had torn her apart inside, the idea that her own genes had failed her son. What tore her apart nowadays was the fact that she had truly thought that, when she should have been cursing the world for its quirkiest ways, should have been rocking her fist into the computer screen that had shown her son that only people with the flashiest and most useful quirks could become heroes. But you can't go back in time. She couldn't fix that moment. She couldn't fix all the ones that come after it, where she looked away from bruises and scratches and a dulling smile, all because she couldn't handle the idea of her lovely little boy experiencing something so painful. She remembers reading a pamphlet a nurse had given to her about quirkless discrimination in the waiting room of the doctor's office while she waited for all the paperwork to be put in order. She remembers reading it and thinking, no, children could never be so cruel. His teachers would never do things like that. Izuku is a bright little boy, he'll be fine. She remembers dropping it in the trash on her way out. Inko could truly strangle her past self. She patted a spot next to her on the sofa. Izuku made no noise as he walked over and took his seat. Inko wondered if he had learned that from one of Aizawa's lessons, or if silencing his footfalls had been a necessity for him in school. She wrapped an arm around him as soon as he was settled in, pulling him to her side. Izuku's head landed on her shoulder automatically. She stroked his hair. "I know it's hard to talk about," she said, her fingers combing through the tangles in her son's soft hair. "I know that you don't want to worry me. I know that there are still things I don't understand. I know that I haven't been the best at helping you. But I promise," her voice started to waver as she choked back her tears, "that I will do better. I promise that you can tell me as little or as much as you want to, and I will be there for you." Izuku shifted on the couch so that he was half kneeling in his mother's lap. He buried his face into her cardigan. His eyes itched, but tears wouldn't come. He wrapped his arms around her and they sat there for a long while. "Hatsum-san, when you said that previous experience in roller skating would be a good thing, I was under the impression that I would be testing roller skates." Izuku windmilled his arms as the hover boots he was wearing let out a cloud of dark smoke, and he was suddenly shifted a few inches to the left. Hatsum, where she was crouched down next to his feet, scooted over and adjusted her goggles so that she could fix whatever had caused the jump. While they were still on his feet, she grinned up at him. "Well, assistant, roller skating utilizes skills like balance and the ability to stay upright when your feet are doing things that they don't usually do. Both things that would be useful while wearing hover boots," Hatsum explained. She had a screwdriver inside one of the shoes, and Izuku could feel something moving around in the boot under her ministration. "I guess that's true," he ceded. Hatsum finished whatever she was doing and then gave the boot a pat on the side. "Okay, show me how my baby runs now." Izuku glided forward hesitantly. He kept one leg straight and pushed off the ground with the toe of the other. Despite his protests, the hover boots really did handle like roller skates when they were running properly. There wasn't that much room to maneuver in Hatsum's room, workshop, basement, so Izuku only drifted 3 feet away before he made contact with one of her workbenches. Hatsum clapped her hands excitedly and shouted, "Oh yes, that's exactly what I'm looking for." She brought a hand to her chin and stared at his feet in deep thought. "Maybe I should install some kind of steering method now that the hover tech has been perfected." "That would probably be a good idea," Izuku agreed. This was his first time seeing Hatsum after months of talking over text. Izuku had been extremely worried that it would be awkward. But as soon as she flung the door to her house open and pulled him off the street with one yank of his wrist, things had gone smoothly. Both of her parents were apparently too busy working on their own babies to introduce themselves until dinner, so it was just Izuku and Hatsum for the next 2 hours. As soon as he was inside of her home, Izuku was blindsided by how much stuff was just strewn around all over the place. There are nuts and bolts on the shelves next to family pictures, bolts of fabric leaning against the wall of the hallway, and a brief glimpse of the Hatsum living room even included a robot. Izuku had struggled to take his shoes off and put them next to Hatsum's because she was pulling insistently on his arm to drag him to her room. In the end, Izuku had to just deal with his sneakers being thrown haphazardly toward the door when she strong-armed him down the hallway. Hatsum had then proceeded to push him down the stairs that led to her room located in the basement. There was a pile of blankets and pillows at the bottom of the stairs that Izuku landed in, but the shove still shocked him enough that Hatsum was able to attach the hover boots to his socked feet while he laid there blinking up at the ceiling that was plastered in blueprints. Hatsum continued, "Maybe some kind of handheld device, or no, that's not practical. Maybe I can put some sensors in there so that the boot knows which way the foot wants to go." She walked over to one of her desks while she spoke and started jotting down ideas on a random piece of construction paper. Izuku hopped up onto the desk that he had run into and tried to remove one of the boots. Keyword, tried. Hatsum, how do I take these off?" he asked. Hatsum's gaze snapped from her paper to Izuku, her eyes quickly traveling over his position. She cackled and loped over, smacking his hand away from the boot and pressing a seemingly random number of buttons that made the shoe unstick from his foot. She pulled Izuku's other foot up and that one fell off too. Oh Izuku, Hatsum sighed dramatically. What would you do without me? Izuku flushed at the use of his first name. He had gotten used to her using it over text. In person was an entirely different situation. Thank you, Hatsum. He hopped off of the desk and took a few steps away from her so that their shoulders weren't brushing anymore. Did you have anything else for me to test out? Hatsum made an expression reminiscent of the greater than she usually sent over text. No, she whined. The first day you're free to be my test dummy and it's right after I finished a bunch of babies. Izuku found himself smiling. It's okay, Hatsum, he comforted her. I've finally got a handle on my training schedule, so we should be able to hang out more often. Hatsum rocked forward onto the balls of her feet, launching herself into his personal space. What's up with that anyway? You said that you're training, but for what? One of her hands latched onto his bicep. I've definitely noticed that you're even more capable of manual labor than you were the last time I saw you. Izuku knew it would be a fruitless effort to try and escape her grasp, so he just let her feel up his new muscles while he tried to work out how to explain. Well, Hatsum interrupted him. Are you planning on applying to a hero school, Izuku? She shouted, her other hand latching onto his shoulder. If so, air hit Izuku's face as she shouted this while holding direct eye contact. I could design your costume for you. She gasped dramatically. We could design it together. You would look great in a Hatsum costume. What if we both go to UA? Then you would be able to rep my babies in the sports festival. Hatsum pulled back and started pacing around the room. Or actually, isn't support gear banned for hero course students? We'll have to see if there's a workaround for that. Izuku internally winced at the mention of UA. On the outside, he tried to speak again. I didn't apply to any hero schools. Hatsum looked genuinely confused for the first time since he had met her. What? I am training to be a hero, but I guess we haven't actually talked about it yet. Actually, I don't know what Aizawa-sensei's plan is. Izuku stopped talking when both of Hatsum's hands descended upon his cheeks and squished. But you are going to be a hero, right? She asked. Her golden eyes were unreasonably intense. I think so, he managed to say. That's all that matters then, Hatsum declared. Let's work on your costume while we wait for dinner. Or I'm not sure if. Nonsense, assistant. You deserve only the best of the best. And that means getting a head start on the kind of tech you're going to be using. Hatsum grabbed a notebook and a pen off of her desk and then flopped down onto the landing pad that she had in front of her stairs. She wiggled until she was to one side of the pillow pile and then patted the spot next to her. Izuku sat down cross-legged on the floor in front of her and then fought the natural instinct to roll his eyes that rose up when Hatsum pouted at him. Roll his eyes. Izuku tried very hard to remember the last time that he had ever gotten such an urge. Maybe the last time that Kaken had hurled a particularly lame insult his way. Maybe that time when Aizawa literally threw his phone across the gym because his husband had started shouting in his ear. A bit of an overreaction if you asked Izuku, but who was he to judge? Maybe the mysterious Hizashi had a voice quirk that could be translated over the phone. This was, however, the first time that Izuku was tempted to actually do it. With Kaken, one wrong move could lead to an explosion. With Aizawa, well, Izuku was half sure that Aizawa would roll his eyes right back, but he didn't want to disrespect his teacher like that. Next time, Izuku amended. Hatsum would probably just laugh at him and it wouldn't be a friendship-ending show of disrespect. He was almost certain. Okay, whatever, don't sit next to me because I'm a girl and I have cooties. Hatsum mocked him, waving her pen at him, real mature assistant. Wow, opportunities really did come faster than you expected sometimes. Izuku rolled his eyes. Hatsum stuck her tongue out at him with zero hesitation and then started scribbling on the paper in front of her. Just for that, I'm going to make your costume super impractical and lame. Hatsum turned the paper toward Izuku to show a doodle of what was presumably supposed to be him, in a scribbled blob of colors with an arrow pointed at it labeling it trash. Of course, Hatsum was using one of those color-changing clicky pens. Izuku didn't know how he hadn't noticed that immediately. Hatsum tapped the pen against her cheek after she was sure that he had gotten a good look at her doodle. For real though, she started. What's your quirk? Because that's a pretty important thing to consider when designing a cos. Hatsum trailed off when she looked up from the rough outline of a person that she had on her paper to see Izuku's face, completely blank, ... tomb. At her question, Izuku had felt a spear of cold and deadly dread pierce him through the chest, most likely through one of his lungs because he felt like he couldn't breathe. He should be used to this, he really should. But he was having such a good time and he didn't want to ruin it. He didn't even think about it while he fought to conceal the trepidation in his stomach. Hatsum watched as a pleasant smile replaced the blank look. If she had looked up a second later, she wouldn't have been clued into anything being off. Izuku rubbed the back of his neck with his hand, subtly digging his nails into the skin along his hairline to ground himself, contrasting the cold dread that was seeping into his bones with a small stab of warm pain. Well, Izuku began, forcing his voice to be light-hearted. Hatsum, a voice from upstairs shrieked. Hatsum and friend, dinner is ready. Izuku took the escape. I'll tell you later, he told Hatsum cheerfully, unfolding his legs and holding a hand out to her so that he could help her up from the pile of pillows that she was launched in. Hatsum narrowed her eyes at him minutely. She opened her mouth to say something, but then her mother threw the door to the basement open. It slammed against the wall and Hatsum and Izuku both whipped around to look at the woman in the entryway. She was pretty much a carbon copy of Hatsum. She had the same golden eyes and the same pink hair. Her hair was in braids and was much longer than Hatsum's. She had a pair of square glasses perched on her nose delicately. Another face poked around the doorway. The man, presumably Hatsum's father, had black hair. And in place of his eyes were two shiny camera lenses that blinked back at Izuku. Come on, the woman yelled, her hands settling on her hips as she smiled down at the two teenagers. I made your favorite and it's going to get cold if you don't get a move on. Any suspicion in Hatsum's eyes fled upon hearing those words. She pumped a fist into the air and latched onto Izuku's wrist while she dragged them up the stairs. Hatsum's mother stepped aside and slapped them both on the back when they passed her. A soft shuddering noise echoed behind them while Izuku was shoved down into a wooden chair at the dinner table. Izuku gathered himself, slightly reeling from the fast-paced sprint through the house and subsequent manhandling that brought him there. The smell of fried pork cutlet assaulted him. Hatsum already had food in her mouth. The hand not holding her chopsticks was fanning her mouth while she chewed the piping hot food. A hand ruffled her hair as her parents took their spots. Hatsum's mother sat across from Izuku and her father across from her. Her dad was chuckling. Another shudder could be heard as he leaned back in his chair. Darling, don't eat too fast or you'll burn yourself. While he spoke, he reached behind his head and fished a photograph out of his hair. He held it up to his daughter. You look silly eating like that. Hatsum swallowed and then stuck her tongue out at her father. She snatched up the photo and shoved it into Izuku's jacket pocket without looking up from the next bite that she was taking. A memento for my assistant to mark his first gig as my test dummy, she said around the food. Izuku's ears burned. He picked up his chopsticks. Thank you for the food, he told her parents. He blew on the bite before he put it into his mouth, wary of the steam that was still emanating from the bowl. It wasn't as good as his mom's, but it was still pretty good. Hatsum's mother and father started eating as well. Silence fell over the table for all of 5 seconds. So Izuku, was it? How did you and Mei meet? Izuku opened his mouth to respond, but Hatsum slammed her hand down on the table and took control of the conversation before he got a chance. It was nice. Asami introduced him to me because he's cleaning the garbage dump beach and she thought he could use some friends, she said excitedly. He's been a great assistant for my practice at costume design. He knows a lot about what will look good and complement someone's quirk. She shot a glance at Izuku, even if he doesn't look like he does. Izuku became very self-conscious of the plain shirt and blue hoodie that he was wearing rather suddenly. He took a drink of water. Oh really? Her father exclaimed. That's wonderful. That beach is in a horrible state. I'm glad that people are finally working together to do something about that. No, Dad. Hatsum interrupted. He's cleaning it by himself. Hatsum's mother pushed her glasses up the bridge of her nose. Her father took another picture, the shuddering of the lenses filling the room momentarily. Oh, he said, and how far along are you? He's already got around 1/3 of it cleared. Hatsum waved her hands around in excitement. Asami told me that a week or so ago, so he might be even closer to half now. My. Her father exclaimed, putting a photo face down on the table next to his place absent-mindedly while he spoke. Now that Izuku could see him without the doorframe in the way, he saw that the man was wearing a lab coat with various dark stains on it. That's quite a lot of work for one boy. Color me impressed. Asami-sen has been helping me a lot. I really own her, Izuku hurried to say before Hatsum could intercept him again. As much as he was enjoying not having to answer questions, he was afraid that Hatsum was coloring him as much cooler than he actually was. Hatsum's mother tisked. Oh, I'm sure you're paying her back in all the supplies you're saving from that dump. Are you planning on going into support, Izuku-kun? Hatsum jumped in her seat. Oh no, she exclaimed. Izuku is going to be a hero, and I'll be the one to design his costume, so back off. The room filled with laughter at Hatsum's threat. Izuku forced out a few giggles to blend in. Then he went about changing the topic. Are you involved in support? He asked them both. Oh yes, her father responded. My quirk lets me take pictures, so I'm involved in a lot of quirk research as a record keeper. He leaned across the table and whispered, but my real passion is in alternative fuel production. Oh, that's cool, Izuku replied. And I, Hatsum's mother interrupted, can look at something and immediately know how far away it is from me. It's not particularly useful in my field, however, since I develop all-inclusive gadgets for heroes. Smoke bombs, grappling hooks, handcuffs, things like that, except way cooler and confidential. Wow, that's so, Izuku tried to reply. but they both do a lot of inventing on the side, Hatsum explained, launching into a catalog of all the gadgets that had been produced in their house that week in reverse chronological order. Izuku felt a smile pull at his mouth and he settled back in his chair to listen for the rest of the evening. When he left, Hatsum waved vigorously from the doorstep. Izuku thought about how he was going to lose her. Maybe not entirely, but after she found out, it probably wouldn't be the same. She wouldn't shove him into dangerous inventions or tease him or talk about designing his hero costume. She wouldn't call as often or ask for his advice or… When Izuku got home, he pinned the photo that Hatsum's dad had given him up above his desk, in the empty space the posters used to fill. It was a good photo, not blurry, no light flares. Hatsum was fanning her mouth and grinning at the camera. Izuku was wearing a smile that hadn't even been intentional and looking at her with his eyes slightly wide in panic over the unexpected situation he had found himself in. No, Izuku would at least still have her, he decided. Hatsum was a good person, a good friend. She wouldn't dump him entirely when she found out he wasn't as useful as she thought he was. Nishio Orochi barely heard the bell of his little shop ring anymore. Woodworking was a lost art in this day and age, he often grumbled. His family had been in the business even before quirks developed. It was mostly luck that his family line had gotten quirks related to their beloved profession. Orochi sold most of his work online nowadays, with the help of his grandson who had designed his website. He was thinking about closing the shop entirely. He spent too many hours out front hoping for customers instead of watching his soaps or working on commissions. He was considering going to the door and turning the sign to close so that he could catch up on his shows when the dusty bell rang. A young man entered. He had on a white t-shirt that had t-shirt printed across it in black writing and a pair of dark wash jeans. The old man huffed at the shirt. He put his glasses on while he scooted forward in his chair. Orochi squinted. The boy also had a long-sleeve shirt on under the loose-fitting t-shirt, but the shadowy ensemble was broken up by the bright yellow backpack that hung from his shoulders. The boy was short for his age. Orochi couldn't help but notice when he came up to the counter. "What can I do for you, boy?" Orochi asked. He was a nervous one, that was for sure. The boy was fiddling with his hands and could barely make eye contact with Orochi when he spoke. However, the boy reminded him of his grandson, with the green hair and the anxious disposition, so he wasn't too annoyed about it, though his grandson was considerably more aggressive than this boy. "I was wondering if you knew anything about how to fix a dock. I tried to do research online, but most of it was about building a dock. But I took pictures if you want to see them. The support poles are all right, it's just the flooring and the handrails that need to be fixed because a lot of it is broken." The boy said all of this in a rush. The words left his mouth in a quick and orderly fashion. Orochi suppressed the urge to tease the young man with his "I couldn't hear you" act. "Let me see the photos then," he demanded. It would be a nice project. Fixing up a dock out in the warm breeze with the sun on his back. It would at least get him out from behind the goddamn counter waiting for people who preferred to do their consulting through screen. The boy shuffled his bag to one shoulder and twisted around to dig through it. Orochi couldn't help but admire the kid for spending a Saturday doing this kind of thing. The youth wasn't completely lost after all. This boy wasn't like his grandson, all day on his computer yelling into a headset. The boy handed over the pictures and Orochi immediately recognized his own work. "Oh, I would recognize this anywhere. This is the pier at that municipal beach park nearby," he grumbled under his breath trying to remember the name. "What was it? Takaba. Topeka." The young man interjects softly, "Takoba." Orochi snapped his fingers. "Ah, good old Takoba, that was great work. It's in a horrible state now though, isn't it? People have turned it into an illegal dump site, haven't they?" He scoffed. "All my good work gone to fucking waste." Orochi set the photos down on the counter. They weren't actually photos. They were printed on normal paper. This was funny to Orochi for some reason. However, he kept his mirth to himself. He rubbed a hand over his beard before responding, his eyes still glued to the photos on the counter. "I could redo this easily if the structural poles are still intact." "Why do you ask, anyway?" The boy shuffled a bit while he answered. "I am cleaning up Takoba and when I finish I want people to be able to enjoy it, so a working dock seemed like a good idea." Orochi let out a deep laugh. "Yes, a good idea indeed." He leaned back and looked the boy up and down. "I'll tell you what, I'll do it for a reduced price. Just come back when you need me, or send an email through my website and we'll set something up." "Oh, thank you so much, sir." The young boy scrapped his photographs up off the counter. "Hopefully I'll be soon. My name is Midoriya Izuku, just so you know who to look for if I end up emailing." Orochi nodded. Then he started shouting, "Heike, write down the name Midoriya Izuku on your computer so that you know to pay attention when you get an email from him." He lowered his voice and spoke covertly to Midoriya. "My grandson designed my website and he handles most of the incoming emails for me because I hate that shit." Midoriya nodded, looking a bit shocked. Orochi grinned. "Okay, old man," Heike shouted back. "Why don't you come out here and greet the man? This way it actually sticks in your TV rotted head." Orochi shot back. The anxious boy in front of him shook his head rapidly, no doubt trying to signal to Orochi that was completely unnecessary. Well, signal received and tough shit. Heike needed to get off his ass more often and he could use a friend around his age. One that he actually knew in person. A loud sigh bounced around the shop and a door slammed open, the smell of wood chips and sawdust drifting in from the workroom that Heike had set up camp in. Ever since Heike and his family had moved to Musutafu a few months ago, his grandson had commandeered a corner of his workshop to sit in and fiddle around on his laptop all day long. Heike had his head thrown back dramatically, his shoulder-length light green hair flopping around when he swung around to look at the front of the shop. Orochi grinned wolfishly at his grandson when he stopped in place, obviously catching sight of the boy his age. The door almost hit Heike in the face. "Oh," Heike said. He smoothed out the oversized hoodie he had on like that would somehow improve his outfit. His eyes were trained on Midoriya, scanning the young man up and down, trying to get his bearings in the situation that Orochi had launched him into. His grandson's outfit consisted of bright blue basketball shorts, bare feet, and the aforementioned oversized hoodie that was a slightly less abrasive shade of red that Orochi hesitated to call pink only because he was of the old-fashioned opinion that pink wasn't a color boys should wear. Heike ended up putting his hands behind his head and strolling toward Midoriya and Orochi all casual-like, as if he hadn't just made a bit of a fool out of himself because it took him so long to process the fact that there was another boy his age in the building. Orochi struggled not to laugh as his grandson leaned against the counter, his hands still in that cavalier pose held behind his head, and looked at Midoriya out of the corner of his eye. He was very obviously trying to be intimidating, and in Orochi's opinion, he was failing spectacularly. Midoriya might have thought differently though, because he was looking back and forth between them like a startled rabbit. Orochi leaned over the counter and wrenched Heike's hands down so he didn't look like an asshole and then introduced them. "Heike, this is Midoriya. He's cleaning the beach and he's going to email us when he's done so that we can fix up the old pier. Why don't you give him a handshake?" Heike rolled his eyes but stuck his hand out for the smaller boy to shake. Heike couldn't help but notice that the boy's ears were pink, and his hand was shaking just the smallest amount. Heike kind of wanted to flirt with him. He suppressed this urge because his grandfather was literally hovering over his shoulder. "Midoriya, maybe we should just exchange numbers," he suggested, letting his fingers linger for just a moment too long when the handshake ended. "That way I don't have to sort through all the requests, and yours can be top priority." Orochi let out an uproarious laugh. "There's the Heike I know, always trying to get out of work." Heike ignored his grandfather and kept his eyes trained on the boy in front of him, quirking an eyebrow at Midoriya. Sure, why not?" The boy stuttered. He pulled on one of his sleeves and Heike had to keep his smug smile under control. Midoriya handed his phone over to Heike with a nervous smile. "Cool, maybe we can play video games together sometimes," Heike told Midoriya while he entered his contact information. He snapped a quick picture with his tongue out for his contact photo and texted himself. Heike spied the photos on the counter and handed those back to him alongside his phone. "Until next time, Midoriya." He waved goodbye as Midoriya nodded and then quickly retreated from the shop. "Why did you have to go and intimidate the boy?" Orochi huffed, stroking his beard while he watched the door swing closed. Heike scoffed. "That wasn't me trying to be intimidating, old man." Sure, Orochi said, and that's why he scrambled out of here like a frightened deer. His grandfather sighed. "I might close the shop early today, catch the end of my shows." Heike was already halfway back to the workroom. "Oh, yeah, Gramps, that sounds fine." He waved a hand at Orochi, his phone in his hand as he smirked down at the outgoing text that he had sent to himself from Midoriya's phone. "Unknown number. This is the hot boy from the woodworking shop's number. Your phone is ringing," Aizawa said dryly, throwing another punch and tracking Izuku's form as he sidestepped away from the blow. "It's probably Hadasme," Izuku breathed out, panting as the sparring match dragged out longer and longer with each move he avoided. "They've been going at it for the last hour. Maybe we should take a break," Aizawa offered. He eyed the sweat on his student's face. "And no," Izuku said quickly, "I've only managed to touch you, twice so far." Aizawa raised an unimpressed eyebrow. "Exactly the reason why we should take a break," he replied, officially stepping out of the ring. He picked up his own phone to check if Hisashi had sent him anything. "Take a minute to clear your head and think about what you could do differently." Izuku sighed, a long and drawn-out thing that he never would have tried to get away with earlier in their relationship, and walked over to the duffel bag he had purchased specifically for training. He took a delicate sip of his water bottle after digging his phone out of the bag. The feeling of the cold water streaming down his throat was otherworldly. He typed in his passcode, swiped to the missed calls section. Then he had to stop drinking his water, lest he choke, when the name there wasn't Midoriya & Co. or Hatsume but Nishia Heike. Izuku's thumb hovered the redial option. He wasn't sure why Nishia would call him so soon. He'd only met the boy a few days ago. He wouldn't expect Izuku to already be finished cleaning the beach, would he? While he stared at Nishia's contact picture in indecision, his phone started ringing again. It was a video call. Izuku's quiet anxiety over Nishia initiating contact spiked when he was confronted with his own face staring back at him from the screen. His hair was damp with sweat and he was flushed with exertion, and he was wearing a tank top, so if he held his phone at a comfortable distance, Nishia would be forced to look at his freckled shoulders, and he was overall not in the proper physical or mental state to pick up the call. So naturally, his mentor took things into his own hands. Aizawa wandered over, amused and curious about why Izuku would choke on his water over a phone call from the famed Hadesmime, who Izuku was texting more and more during breaks. His steps were silent because they usually were, and he didn't see the need to announce his presence to Izuku when he intended to snoop over his student's head. When he saw that Izuku was standing, frozen, with his phone ringing, it was instinct to click the accept call button. Years of living with his husband, who sometimes spaced out in the middle of writing an email, meant that Aizawa didn't think twice about completing tasks like that. His hand snaked around his pupil's shoulder and he tapped the green icon gently so that he didn't accidentally jostle the device out of Izuku's hand. He blinked in distant surprise when the person on the other side of the call was not the pink-haired mad scientist that he was used to seeing on the rare occasion that Izuku got video calls. Instead, there was a boy with pale green hair and light brown eyes. Izuku made a distressed noise and shot a panicked look over his shoulder at Aizawa. It was dawning on Aizawa that he may have just made a mistake, so he quickly retreated back to the other side of the room. "Midoriya?" Nishia asked, tilting his head to the side so that his hair shifted to reveal one side of his throat. Izuku quickly turned his head back from where he was staring at Aizawa, who was no longer behind him, but all the way across the room and pointedly not looking at Izuku. If Aizawa was more dramatic, he would probably be whistling with his hands in his pockets. Izuku felt like he was going to pass out. The thing was that Nishia was older than him and pretty, and Izuku was a mess and also still didn't know why Nishia would want to talk to him. Izuku cleared his throat in an attempt to scrape the sticky nerves off of them. "And Nishia," he squeaked out, the remaining anxiety on his vocal cords contorting around his voice so that his words came out much different than how he wanted them to. Izuku cleared his throat again, his eyes looking everywhere but his phone's screen. "Nishia, what's up?" Izuku wouldn't know, because he wasn't looking at his phone, but Nishia had a look on his face that was reminiscent of cat that had somehow gotten hold of either cream or canaries, maybe both with the amount of glee Nishia was exuding. "Nothing much," he replied, his eyes raking up and down his phone to take in the sight before him. "I was just wondering if you were ever going to text me so that we could play games together, but I guess now was a bad time to call. Are you working out or something?" "Or something," Izuku replied without thinking, finally dragging his gaze to his phone. He swallowed when he saw that Nishia was staring very intently at the screen. I'm sorry that I'm kind of a mess," Izuku said. "Oh, no, you're fine, Midoriya." Nishia responded almost too quickly. "Tank tops are definitely a good look on you." Nishia was fingering a choker that he had on, pulling on it slightly while he talked and drawing attention to his painted fingernails. "You should wear one when you come over to play wild fights with me." Nishia's expression somehow got even smugger at Izuku's reaction. "Oh wow," Izuku said, sparkles in his eyes. "You already have that?" "It only came out a few days ago. I was going to watch someone review it online, but..." Nishia cut him off. "But now you don't have to. Come over on Sunday." Izuku could feel his cheeks heating up. He tried not to look at his own picture in the corner of the screen because he knew he would be an atrocious shade of red. Are you sure?" Izuku ended up asking, shocked that someone already in high school would want to hang out with a loser like him and let him play the newest addition to the Wild Pussycats video game collection. "Yeah," Nishia said easily. "I still have your number even though you didn't text me." Nishia scrunched up his face in mock anger, but there was still a smile on his face and the playful anger quickly dissolved. "So I can text you my address." The expression on Izuku's face was a perfect balance between nervous and flattered. From Aizawa's place across the room, he could tell that Izuku was about to turn down the offer, so Aizawa, this time on purpose, took matters into his own hands. "Sounds great," he shouted. "Izuku will see you then, but right now he has to get back to training." Izuku's expression didn't change, but there was absolute confusion and panic behind his gaze when his eyes flicked up to Aizawa. Aizawa gave his pupil a toothy grin. "Great," Nishia said happily. "I'll text you the deets soon. See you then, Midoriya." He then, wisely, ended the call before Izuku could try and talk his way out of the meetup. Izuku put his phone away and took another sip of his water before turning to Aizawa. "Why?" he demanded, his voice barely above a pained whisper. Aizawa shrugged, stepping back into the ring and flexing his hands before curling them into fists. Amusement curled around his stomach. He couldn't wait to tell Hisashi about this at dinner. "You need more friends," and he seemed nice. Izuku also stepped back into the ring. "Thank you for your concern," he said diplomatically. Aizawa huffed in response. "Did you manage to rethink your strategy while you talked to your new friend?" "MMMHM." Izuku hummed, shifting onto his toes. Their fight lasted even longer than the first one. Izuku managed not to be completely outclassed, an astronomical feat when your teacher had 10+ years of experience on you. When they were done, Aizawa was satisfied that Izuku was balancing his defense and offense. Izuku ran through his usual workout and stretches before moving to the side of the gym with soft flooring to practice different rolls and jumps. Aizawa settled into his sleeping bag and grabbed the notebook that was next to it. He leafed through the pages with one hand while he got out his red pen with the other, uncapping it with his teeth. Izuku's recent analysis assignments were as impeccable as they had always been. In the beginning, there was a rough edge to his assignments. The difference between analyzing villains versus heroes was apparent in the way that Izuku came up with ways for the villains to win instead of ways that he could take them down. And there was a tentative tone to some of his more out-there ideas, his anxiety manifesting on the paper in the form of eraser marks and crossed-out commentary. For Izuku, analysis was almost like a diary. He wrote down everything about the subject, but his own thoughts and ideas mixed and made it a much more personal experience. The idea of having his teacher read that was unsettling. Over time, however, he got used to it. Aizawa's pen marks stopped being horrible reminders of his blind spots and turned into firm reminders to do better, think harder. Not that there was ever much red ink on the pages. Izuku was ridiculously adept at organizing important information and being pessimistic about any scenarios that Aizawa asked him to solve. Most of the ink was Aizawa trying to get Izuku to recognize his own strengths. If you were fighting someone with very little fighting experience, you would win. Was written in one margin. An arrow pointed from the statement to a passage of Izuku's analysis wherein Izuku went through the steps of escaping the villain's hold, wrongfully assuming that he would ever be caught in the first place. Despite your inexperience and blatant anxiety, you would be able to talk down a child who lost control of their quirk. You're good at reading people and children are barely people. Aizawa's lazy handwriting commented underneath another passage. Stop underestimating yourself. Was written in all caps on one of the most recent assignments, with 2 lines underneath to showcase the importance. Aizawa wasn't usually so aggressively supportive with his students, but Izuku had been a special case from the beginning. He was too used to being put down, too used to being told to not even try. Aizawa glanced up from the analysis briefly when he heard an impact. Izuku was sprawled out on one of the mats, clearly having missed one of the jumps that Aizawa had set up out of UAS various assortment of colorful crash pads. Izuku laid there staring up at the beams in the ceiling. Aizawa went back to grading his assignment. A few minutes later, Aizawa watched out of the corner of his eye as Izuku launched himself again and this time stuck the landing. Aizawa hid his smile behind the notebook, sinking further into his sleeping bag as he listened to Izuku mutter to himself. Izuku was beginning to think that perhaps this important emergency test run wasn't actually an important emergency test run. They had called him about an hour after he got out of training with Aizawa. His teacher walked him to the train station, and then Izuku rode only to the stop nearest to the beach before getting off and trying to get as much work as possible done before the sun set and he had to head home. Studies had always been things that Izuku looked forward to. He didn't have to go to school. He could stay up as late as he wanted. He didn't have to worry about confrontations with Kaken. He used to spend his studies either at home with his mom, both of them reading on the couch, or out chasing hero fights. Now he spent them in the gym with Aizawa and then at the beach. Sundays were now reserved for cleaning the beach or for spending time with Hatsume, though they hadn't met up at her home since Izuku had met her parents. Most of Hatsume's inventions were more explosive than the hoverboots were. Hatsume's go-to location for testing things was a skate park a few train stops from her house. Apparently she had been going there for a while because graffitied onto the curved wall of the skating bowl in bright pink was Hatsume's testing grounds. Use the other pool, with various other tags on the surrounding surface. Hatsume's parents had their own labs and workshops, but they weren't adequately reinforced for the types of things that Hatsume liked to test. A large abandoned skate park in a dilapidated part of town where no one cared if you filled the cracks in the cement in yourself with untested and unapproved building materials suited her needs much better. The first time Izuku had seen it, there to act as a moving target for some heat-seeking paint pellets, he had been gobsmacked. There were cracks and holes in the cement filled in with colorful plaster, graffiti up and down all the ramps, and someone who was most definitely a drug dealer hanging out around the side of a nondescript building bordering the park. There were a series of small holes in the side of the pool that were filled in with a glittery blue substance that threw iridescent sparkles against the curved walls when the sun hit them at the right angle. A large purple blob protruded from the ground at the base of one of the pool's walls, creating a rounded surface that was bouncy to the touch. From the way that the purple rubber seeped from the cracks around it, one could assume that it had been used to fill in a crater. And the substance had expanded unexpectedly, the same way that her family home encapsulated their unique brand of mad scientists. and how Hadasume's room reflected her personality perfectly with its multiple workbenches and pillow landing pad at the bottom of the stairs. The sloppily repaired skate park was such a Hatsume place that Izuku liked it instantly, despite being vaguely worried about Hatsume spending so much time in a part of town where drug dealers lurked around corners and teenagers with piercings shouted as they passed by on their wheels. He spent that day jogging around ramps and ducking around corners to try and outsmart the paint pellets. He had been surprised that day because he had to slow down after he had outrun the first set of bullets Hatsume shot at him. Hatsume whined about how normal people can't run that fast to Izuku, but she had diligently recorded his speed versus the speed of her bullets in her notes. How slowly Izuku had to take turns to allow for the pellets to understand his path, the distance that needed to be between them for the bullets to zip after him and not Hatsume. The next Sunday that they came out to the skate park, Hatsume cackled maniacally while Izuku broke a sweat trying to escape the new and improved versions of the bullets, each different color getting progressively harder to dodge. It was as much of a challenge as his usual training sessions with Aizawa were, except that afterward, instead of being walked home and given new assignments, Hatsume dragged him to a small diner where they got odd looks for their paint splatter, clothes, and faces as they settled into the booth. Izuku hadn't intended to order anything. He and Hatsume were going to go over the data she collected and then talk about what could be better, what she could change, what Izuku's suggestions were. It was quickly becoming his favorite part of testing inventions with Hatsume. They had these intense conversations in which they both gestured furiously to their own notes. Izuku jolted halfway through discussing the possibility of using the device within the pellets for not only hitting the target but also tracking them. A cold bead of condensation hit his fingertips where they were wrapped around a glass that had a milkshake in it. He set it down on the table carefully. He remembered Hatsume's eyes focused intently on his expression. "I know you said you really didn't want anything, but I figured my assistant deserved a reward for his hard work today and for all the good ideas you're providing me with." Hatsume burst out when Izuku didn't pick up the conversation again. She was as loud and brash as always, but she didn't move her hands at all. They had green and yellow paint on them and they stayed completely still against the table. "Thank you," Izuku hurried to say, coming out of his funk and realizing that his reaction may have been a touch dramatic. "Thank you. I didn't think about it, so I was kinda confused about suddenly having a milkshake. That's all. Sorry." Hatsume's hands were still splayed out on the table, unnaturally still even while she tilted her head at him in an impersonation of her usual expressiveness. "I apologize if I was presumptive. It's just that the only two things I've seen you eat are ice cream and katsudon," so she cut herself off and bit her lip. "I mean, that's not weird or anything. We haven't hung out much outside of testing stuff, so it makes sense that I shouldn't have much data on you. Maybe I'll send you a survey." Her voice tilted up at the end of the question. Odd, because usually when Hatsume asked questions it was more like she was telling you to answer than actually requesting you to. It had been the first time Izuku ever heard Hatsume be so unsure. Over text she was quick to spew out paragraphs of questions and make plans and be unapologetically herself. This was their third meeting in person. It made sense that she might be nervous, especially since they were quickly burning through all of the topics pertaining to her baby. Izuku sat in the booth, looked at her still hands and the way that barely any of her food was eaten, and at her notebook that had a checklist on it, and he made a decision. He had to steel his nerves. "May we can that is if you want to. We don't always have to be doing experiments or testing. We can also, just hang out. That's what friends are." Izuku's voice stalled in his throat for a moment as he realized he may not actually have experience in what he was saying. He recovered quickly, wrapping both hands around the chilled glass of the milkshake she had ordered him and dragging it toward him in a show of acceptance. "That's what friends are for, right?" He didn't let his voice shake. May's fingers twitched against the table. "Right," she shouted loud enough that their waitress glared at them. "You are absolutely correct, assistant. So tell me all of your favorite snacks." After that encounter their friendship had truly settled. They were friends. They talked about hero news and support gear, but Hatsume also complained to him about how annoying her mom could be about her homeschooling, and Izuku tried to make sure he told her things about his training. Sundays were when they hung out, and sometimes Izuku strapped armor on or tried to push robots down, but sometimes they went to the diner and had milkshakes, or Izuku tried to teach Hatsume how to roller skate so that she could wear her own hoverboard when she finally finished them. Sometimes in the middle of a conversation Izuku would get the urge to just tell her, just get it over with. She would either throw him out instantly or, and this was the outcome that seemed more and more likely to Izuku, she wouldn't care. They were close, they were friends. Izuku thought that maybe they were becoming best friends. He loved training with Aizawa on Saturdays, but Sundays were quickly becoming his most anticipated day of the week. The rest of the week was him drudging through school. and trying to subtly hold conversations with Hatsum under his desk and perfecting the rotation schedule for what bathroom he ate lunch in and getting ahead on homework and projects so that his weekend was completely free and ducking through different hallways whenever he saw one of his more violent bullies so that Aizawa didn't give him that look when he came to training, and making sure to run through his routine after his homework, then collapsing into bed while doing mental math in his head to try and figure out how many mornings he was going to spend booking it to the beach to move maybe 2 things and then sprinting back to shower before class. It was kind of exhausting. It was the most alive Izuku had felt since he was 5. Nishiya's invitation to play video games with him on Sunday was throwing Izuku out of the routine he had created for himself. But Aizawa had already confirmed that Izuku would be there, so he was going to have to tell Mei they couldn't meet until next week. He would have been able to see both of them if Nishiya had given him a time. But currently he was in the dark about when he needed to be ready to go. He couldn't risk cleaning the beach or hanging out with Mei because then he might be late and then Nishiya might conveniently lose his number and Izuku would have to find someone else to help him fix the pier. So, he sent off a quick text telling her that he had plans and couldn't hang out Sunday. And not 5 minutes later, the sun slowly creeping down into the horizon, she called about the super important emergency test that she absolutely needed him for, and would he please come over and help her even though it was late. He should have made the connection earlier. But Mei had sounded so convincing over the phone that he just asked his mom if he could stop by before grabbing his duffel bag and heading for the train station. After all, it was the least he could do for breaking their standing agreement to spend time together every Sunday. Now, he held a toothbrush, still in its packaging, in one hand and a pair of Mei's father's pajamas in the other. The super important emergency had somehow disappeared when Izuku reached Mei's front door and her parents tutted over him when he tried to leave. There had surely been a conversation while he stood on their steps, but for the life of him Izuku could barely recall what Mr. and Mrs. Hatsum had talked about, too caught up in his own realizations about Hatsum's true purpose for calling him. It was something about a small kind boy like him on the train all alone at night. No, that won't do, and if he fell for her ruse then what else would he fall for? Honey, and I know that he's her first friend, but there are still rules about these sorts of things, and they can sleep in the living room and the clock bot will watch them. And darling, he clearly fell into Mei's trap. We can't turn him away. It would be unfair to her at this point, and I've already spoken to his mother, so. Mei shoved him out of his state of shock, both literally and metaphorically, as she shouldered him into the bathroom. She had a giddy expression on her face. You change and brush your teeth. I'll pick a movie and make popcorn. Then maybe I'll paint your nails because I've seen a lot of people do that in movies and I feel like I have a steady enough hand for it, plus I have a red that pretty much matches your shoes, and then we can talk about your mysterious plans, Izuku. Mei's speech was muffled by the bathroom door and Izuku blinked at his own lost expression in the mirror. Duped. Mei had duped him into a sleepover. Izuku changed into the oversized pajamas numbly. He barely registered the soft feeling of the flannel as he tied the string tight as it would go. The shirt was large enough that no matter how he adjusted it entirely, too much of his shoulders and collarbones were on display. He folded his clothes and set them on the toilet lid while he brushed his teeth. Each stroke of the bristles over his teeth felt damning. He was going to stay the night with Mei, his first real friend. She was going to ask him about his plans, and Izuku would probably end up showing her Nishiya's contact photo, and he had no idea what would come out of that. To be completely honest, Izuku wasn't really sure why Nishiya wanted to hang out in the first place. So trying to explain to Mei why he was ditching their regular hangout for this random boy who strong-armed him into playing video games wasn't an experience that Izuku was prepared for. And what if they ran out of things to talk about? What if she moved on from his mysterious plans and wanted to talk about designing his costume again? It would be fun, surely, but it was dangerous ground to tread on for multiple reasons. The first being that unlike pretty much every other kid in the country, he wasn't applying to UA, and the second being his quirkless status. Izuku splashed some water on his face and glared at his hands until they stopped trembling. Mei was his best friend. No matter what happened at her surprise sleepover, it would be fine. He picked up his clothes with steady hands and then shuffled the bundle over to the crook of his arm so that he could pull open the door. He walked down the hallway with silent socked feet and then peered into the living room. It was less of a mess than the first time he saw it. There was a plush rug on the floor and a coffee table covered in various mechanical parts and a nail file, and a few bottles of nail polish, but the couch was clean except for a few blankets folded upon one arm. A television that seemed almost too large to be held up on the wall was open to a screen with a bunch of different movie covers on it. Mei, as promised, had a bowl of popcorn in her lap and was periodically clicking the remote with a serious expression on her face. The clock on the wall behind the couch looked like a normal clock, and that just made Izuku extremely nervous about why Mei's parents would call it the clock bot if it was a normal clock. He wasn't given any more time to worry about things because as soon as he edged into the room, Mei excitedly beckoned him over to her side. They have a documentary about the evolution of trains. Do you want to watch it? She was bouncing up and down on the couch cushions in excitement. The popcorn bowl tilted dangerously, and Izuku's hand shot out to stop it from tipping over Mei's leg and spilling all over the couch. "Sure," he mumbled as his fingers left the plastic. He held his clothes aloft. "Where should I set these?" "Oh," Mei blinked at him, then hummed, "Maybe just over there." She gestured to a bookshelf next to the doorway that had various family photographs set up between thick reference books. Izuku stood up on his tiptoes to delicately set his clothes on top of the structure. He took a moment to examine the photos. It was weird to see someone's past stretched out before you. It wasn't the whole of Mei's past, just snapshots of things that her parents found important. But there was a certain dissonance with realizing that you could have met someone earlier in life and perhaps still been friends. There are a few different photographs, but Izuku's eyes are drawn toward one that shows a little Mei, maybe kindergarten-aged, standing innocently over the remains of something mechanical. It's in so many pieces that Izuku couldn't even begin to guess at what the mess of parts used to be. Little Mei doesn't have the same hairstyle as she does now. Instead of her pink hair being styled into locks, it's in two big puff balls on either side of her head, making her look a bit like a mouse. She's wearing a pair of overalls with a brightly colored shirt underneath sporting the logo of some children's show that Izuku doesn't recognize. Izuku finds himself smiling at the similarities to her current wardrobe. It's neat to know that Mei has always been passionate about technology, taking things apart and putting them back together. As Izuku turns from the shelves to look over at her, he swallows nervously at the look on her face, like she now wants to take him apart and put him back together. Holding the nail file and a bottle of bright red polish aloft, she reminds Izuku of some sort of predator, maybe a tiger or a lion, something with claws and a tendency to play with their food, despite the fact that she's in her pajamas and is sitting crisscross on the couch. The documentary is playing on the screen, and the popcorn had been nestled amongst the metal parts to sit on the coffee table. Mei shakes the bottle lightly and raises her eyebrows at him when he doesn't move toward her. "It matches your shoes, Izuku," she explains. Izuku's hands come together in front of him habitually, and he runs the thumbnail of his right hand under the nails of his left hand. He doesn't actually say anything in response. It's more like a noise that encapsulates his anxieties regarding the prospect is forced from his throat without his say-so. Mei shrugged. "You don't have to if you don't want to, Izuku, but I think I'll be fun," she sings the last bit, waving the bottle a little bit more. This, somehow, is what breaks the tension in Izuku, and a bark of laughter is ejected from his lungs. Something short and sharp and surprised that makes Mei grin even bigger at him. Nail polish doesn't feel anything like how he thought it would, meaning he didn't think it would feel like anything really, so the cold of the wet brush hitting his thumbnail is odd. Izuku almost jerks his hand out of Mei's grasp. They had to file his nails first. They weren't ragged or anything, but picking at them all the time meant that some of them were a little splintered. Now they're nice rounded rectangles that are quickly being covered in paint. Mei was absolutely correct about her assumption in her own nail painting ability. The documentary is actually very interesting, so at first they don't talk, much to Izuku's relief. Mei paints his nails and then her own. They discuss the things going on in the documentary. Then they turn on another one about David's shield. Izuku's anxiety slowly melts as his nails dry. When the clock reaches midnight, Mei and Izuku are giggling like maniacs and tossing popcorn at each other. It's only after the television is off and they're both settled under blankets on opposite sides of the couch. It's such a large piece of furniture that only their toes have even a chance of touching, that they breach the topics of Izuku's anxiety. Izuku has an alarm set on his phone for early in the morning so that he can get home with enough time to get cleaned up before meeting with Nish. Izuku has almost drifted off before Mei speaks. "Izuku," and her voice was quiet and tentative in a way it usually isn't, "what plans do you have tomorrow?" Izuku swallowed and propped himself up on his elbows so that he could look down the length of the couch at her. "This guy I met at a woodshop while I was looking for someone to fix the pier at the beach asked me to play video games with him tomorrow." Izuku's voice is just as quiet as it traveled through the dark to reach Mei's ears. "That's good, Izuku," Mei whispered excitedly, also sitting up in the dark so that they can both look at the vague outlines of each other through the pitch. She said it quickly, like it was imperative that he hear those words before anything else. "Thanks," Izuku responded. I'm nervous about it, I'm not sure." "I'll be fun," Mei insisted, her voice firm. "You're going to have fun." "What's his name?" "Nishia," Izuku answers. "He has the new Wild Pussycats game." He called out of nowhere. "He probably thought you were cool when you met the first time." Mei whisper shouts. "It's easy to see how cool you are, assistant. Maybe when you cement your friendship with Nishia he can become another test dummy." Izuku felt like his own guilt was eating him from the inside out. Mei is so nice. Izuku is ditching her and she invites him over to hang out anyway, and she doesn't know but she deserves to because she's his best friend and she's nice and she shouldn't be friends with someone like him. "Mei," Izuku's voice trembled. "Yeah." He could practically hear her tilting her head to the side in confusion at his sudden shift in tone. And quirkless. It's silent for 2 entire seconds. Izuku felt like he was going to throw up. "I know." Izuku surged up from his half-propped position. You know, May giggles. Yeah, I mean it was obvious after a while. Maybe you wouldn't know because you don't have one, but no one really takes the public quirk law seriously. We've been hanging out so much I figured you either had to be quirkless or had some kind of horrifying power that wasn't fit for casual use. Oh, Izuku flopped back down onto the couch. Oh, May mocked him, her voice pitched higher. Shut up, Izuku flushed, embarrassed. May cackled. Heike briefly thought about actually cleaning his room before texting Midoriya to come over. He did the bare minimum. The clothes on the floor were shoved into a manageable corner of the room. The empty cups were put in the sink in one giant leaning tower. His grandfather was out minding the store, so Midoriya. And he could play the Wild Fights game in the living room without the old man yelling at them. So honestly, it would be silly of Heike to put too much effort into cleaning up his room if they wouldn't even be in there. After brushing his teeth and washing his face, Heike sent Midoriya a simple message with just his address and a time, and then went to change out of his pajamas while he waited for a response. It came while Heike was pulling off his nightshirt. Heike couldn't help the pleased uptick of his lips at the idea of Midoriya anxiously checking his phone for their meeting time. Midoriya, that works for me. Do you want me to bring anything? That's around lunchtime and I don't want to impose. Or should I eat before I come over? Izuku bit his lip, his teeth sinking into the flesh painfully, while he waited for Nishia to respond. Was he being too much? Should he have just said that he would be there and not flood Nishia's messages with his anxiety? Oh God, Nishia. OWO, you can bring something if you want. I'm not very good at cooking, so I was just planning on eating potato chips until dinner lol. Izuku now had to figure out something appropriate to bring to a new acquaintance's house. Izuku did not know what would be appropriate. Midoriya, cool. Should he just make them both a bento? Was that too much? Izuku paced up and down the length of his room. He was already dressed for going out. A black polo shirt and jeans with his signature red sneakers sitting by the door waiting for him to put them on. May and Izuku had separated early in the morning. They had a quick breakfast of cereal where May got increasingly, and worryingly, excited about designing Izuku's hero costume. Izuku, the possibilities are endless now. You can pick whatever theme you want. I don't have to worry about whether or not my gadgets will match with your quirk. I don't have to worry about unforeseen consequences because of quirk factor. I don't have to even think about having to fireproof the inside of the fabric. It's May paused. Her golden eyes glinted in the fluorescent lights of the kitchen. You're a blank canvas, Izuku. Which was a little insulting because even if he didn't have a quirk, he did have preferences when it came to gadgets. He told her this around a spoonful of his own cereal. May flicked milk at him. Then she pushed him out of the door with his shoes in his hands, and Izuku had to close the door because she was too busy rushing down the stairs to her room to start making prototypes. The train ride home had been surreal. Usually, when Izuku rode the train it was crowded. He had to squeeze himself in between people and strain to get a handhold so that he didn't bump into anyone. The early morning light cast the train in a completely different shade of existence. There were only a few bumbling business people and yawning young adults present, so Izuku actually got to take a seat and look through the notes May had hastily scribbled in his notebook before he woke up. Apparently, there were a lot of exclamation points and abandoned doodles. Izuku added his own hesitant ideas, squeezing them in between May's hasty chicken scratch. His own writing wasn't much better, the movement of the railway making his hand unsteady. A tentative kind of excitement colored that page. It was nearly incomprehensible with Izuku and May's scribbles both fighting for space, but even as Izuku ran around his kitchen putting together lunchboxes, he couldn't help but feel an electric anticipation lingering in his chest. A hero costume. An actual, real, practically designed hero costume for him because May thought that he was actually going to become a hero. He distantly thought of UA and the costume ideas section of their application before refocusing on the task at hand. Izuku jerked out of his thoughts, snapping the lids onto his bento. The clock has somehow changed from early in the morning to only 30 minutes before he was due to be at Heike's, and Izuku was, for once, grateful for his tendencies to get lost in memory and musing. He didn't have time to doubt the lunches he had put together, or worry about anything aside from the route he was taking to reach the other boys' apartment building. The train was back to normal for this trip. Bodies pushed at him from every side, and he had to wrap both hands around the bag he was holding so that it wasn't jostled by all of the people moving on and off the train during the lunch rush. He had his phone out of his bag, and he kept anxiously checking the address to make sure he was really on the right train, going in the right direction, and also to reread Heike's texts about their plans. Time seemed to jump again, and Izuku stared at the apartment number and double-checked that he had the right door before hesitantly raising a hand to knock. It was an apartment complex with an open courtyard, and the gate was left wide open. Izuku would have tried to buzz Heike anyway, but all of the labels next to the buzzers were warped with age and water damage, making them unreadable. In the wake of his knock, Izuku gripped the straps of his bag, the flesh of his knuckles turning white. Nishia opened the door with a speed that suggested he was waiting just behind it when Izuku knocked. He had a pleased curve to his lips that felt sinister while simultaneously putting Izuku at ease. "Thank you for inviting me over," Izuku burst out immediately, jerking into a low bow with his hands still clutching his backpack straps. "You're not going to be thanking me when I beat you 100 times in a row," Nishia replied. His feet disappeared from Izuku's field of view as he took a step back. Izuku shifted back into an upright position and followed, toeing his shoes off and letting his eyes wander as he took in the apartment. "You probably will beat me 100 times in a row. I haven't really played that many video games." Izuku forced out a dry laugh at the end to make himself sound less lame. The apartment was a lot like Izuku's own, except perhaps a tad bit messy. There were blankets draped over the couch, and the armchair and one thrown over the edge of the dining table. A stack of cups could be glimpsed from the sink, and the shelves that framed the entertainment system were cluttered with wooden carvings shoved between books and DVD cases. There was a distinct lack of family photographs in the otherwise homely apartment. Nishia flung himself violently onto the couch. One of the blankets fell from the back into a puddle on the floor. Izuku stood awkwardly in the doorway of the living room while Nishia picked up a controller and started to click around a game screen. "You can set your bag wherever you want for now," Nishia said absent-mindedly. The screen he was clicking through was a pastel green color, with the settings displayed next to an anime-esque rendering of Ragdoll with her paws on her hip and a stern expression on her face. Izuku felt like any second someone was going to pop out from around a corner and shout "Gotcha!" It was with this in mind that he gingerly set his bag against the wall and then perched on the very edge of a couch cushion, taking up the other controller that was sat on the armrest. Nishia's eyes raked over him, a full body up and down before Nishia settled further into the couch cushions. Izuku focused his gaze on the TV. The screen was now a pale orange with white cat paws decorating the background. Overlaid on top was a grid of 7x5 boxes with different pro-heroes inside. "I call Maruko," Nishia said. The click of a button on his controller was followed by an animated Maruko appearing on the screen. She did a circle kick in the air before settling into an idle animation, rocking onto the balls of her feet and then back again in an endless cycle. Izuku frantically searched the screen. There was a good cast of heroes. The top 3 were there, obviously All Might, Endeavor, and Hawks, all listed next to each other. Izuku wondered if it took the Pussycats a while to get the licensing for that. Endeavor was notoriously picky about who he allowed to use his image. He ended up picking Pixie Bob, her avatar blowing a kiss at the screen. It was a hasty choice born from the fact that Izuku felt like it would be bad etiquette to spend more than 3 seconds making a choice. "This first round is probably just going to be us figuring out all the controls," Nishia said to the loading screen. Izuku nodded. He tried not to grip the controller too tightly. He ran a fingertip over the smooth texture of the nail polish May had insisted on. It was nice, cool to the touch, and shiny. There were no flaws to disrupt the movement from one side of the nail to the other. "I like how you matched your nails to your shoes," Nishia said. "They look really good. I hardly bother with nail polish because I suck at actually keeping it on my nail." "Thanks, I didn't actually paint them myself. A friend did them for me yesterday," Izuku replied. He pressed a few of the buttons in quick succession now that the game had loaded, watching as Pixie Bob jumped, did a cartwheel, and made a wolf out of the ground using her quirk. "Wow," Nishia said. "I can't believe you're getting all gusset up just for me Midoriya." Pixie Bob abruptly took a flying jump off of the platform that their 2 avatars were standing on. It wasn't on, It's like Izuku's embarrassed stuttering strung forth instantly. His grip on the controller the only thing that kept him from launching it in the air as he waved his hands back and forth as if to clear the misunderstanding from the air. Nishia kept a straight face for maybe 2 seconds before he burst into laughter. It was the kind of laughter that you never see someone do in public. Gasping breaths that turned into snorts and a melting of the body that ended up with Nishia hugging his stomach. "I know," Nishia gasped out between wheezes. "I just wanted to see your reaction. Oh my god, you're priceless Izuku. It's like no one has ever said these kinds of things to you in your life." "It's because no one has," Izuku thought, watching the boy shake as his humor started to dissipate. No one has ever thought of Izuku like that because he has always been a tragedy in the making. No one would ever want to put their eggs in a basket with decaying straw and moth-bitten cloth lining the bottom. Izuku felt, abruptly, like he was leading Nishia into some kind of trap. Things went smoother after that. They played a few rounds of wild fights where Nishia dutifully kicked Izuku's ass. After about an hour had passed, Nishia asked if Izuku had ended up bringing anything to eat and then praised him over how organized his bentos were and how tasty the food was. However, Izuku couldn't shake his revelation from earlier. Tentative excitement and nervousness faded away until Izuku was only a silhouette on a stage, bright lights washing out everything but his shadow. His shadow laughed and tilted sideways on the couch to try and beat Nishia in a game. His shadow told Nishia about the hover boot project he and Mei had been working on. Hands made out of the lack of light washed out the bento boxes before putting them back into Izuku's backpack, playfully teasing Nishia as they washed the tower of cups that was stuck in the sink. Izuku was an actor, a snake in the grass, a cuckoo bird nestled into the warmth of a robin's nest, pushing the eggs closer and closer to the edge. "Oh, come on," Nishia shouted. He threw his controller down onto the couch cushions and crossed his arms, the excess fabric on the sleeves of his hoodie bunching up. Izuku's first victory felt hollow, a poetic ending to a day that had been carefully orchestrated by an imposter. Yes, this is what friendship looks like, right? Izuku turned a bright smile toward Nishia. Izuku's cheeks hurt from all the smiling he had been doing, another prop to further convince the audience. "You almost beat me again," Izuku told Nishia. "It was just at the end when I did a punch combo instead of the ultimate move, I know," Nishia moaned, scrubbing his hand over his face in agitation. The light coming in through the window was fading, the television and its pastel colors the main source of light in the room. "I should probably start heading home," Izuku said. "I have some training I need to do in the morning tomorrow." "Training?" Nishia quirked an eyebrow from his slouched position. The curtains slammed open. Light flooded over the stage, and Izuku's shadow was suddenly stretching thinly behind him. Barely a puddle of darkness split across the floor. "Training for what?" Nishia continued. Izuku took a step back as the other boy cocked his head to the side. His hair moved in that same elegant way that Izuku had admired before, creating a curtain over one of his eyes. It was much harder to get a read on him. Well, Izuku felt as if they had suddenly gone off script, and he was the fumbling actor who was wonderful at memorization but just couldn't do improv. Nishia already knew that he was training. Izuku had already said that, a slip of the tongue that he couldn't take away, so he had to say yes, and he couldn't backtrack. Izuku had figured this moment would come, just not so soon. He and Mei had gotten along so quickly, and he had only yesterday admitted what he was really trying to do. He had only talked to Nishia twice. They were in Act 4 of a play that had never gotten past the overture. "I'm training to be a hero," Izuku said quietly. He kept his eyes trained on Nishia. It was uncomfortable. His instincts begged him to look away, to look down, to avoid being in any way confrontational. But even a slight shift in body language or a revealing of Nishia's other eye might help Izuku discern what he was thinking. If he could figure it out, maybe he didn't have to lose this. Despite feeling like a shadow of himself all day, he had fun. It was a distant sort of fun. One that you would be able to look back on and say that was a fun day, even if at the time things were more complicated than just fun. Nishia was funny and cool and definitely had other friends that he could have been hanging out with instead of Izuku. Nishia told stories about his first year at high school that left Izuku in stitches, hoping that maybe he and Mei would be able to make memories like that. If Mei was Izuku's future partner in all things heroic, Nishia felt like the childhood friend that Izuku had never gotten. One that actually liked him. This is why it was so devastating when Izuku saw the way that Nishia cringed back at Izuku's words. The way his arms crossed again. This time not in a playful, pouting way. Nishia was tense, and his eyebrows kept twitching, creating disappointed wrinkles that appeared and disappeared like ripples. "Ah," Nishia said. Izuku watched as he tugged on a piece of his hair harshly. Likely some type of grounding method for Nishia. "That's cool, Midoriya. You don't seem to think it's very cool," Izuku replied, rubbing one of his arms self-consciously. Nishia shook his head. No, he bit his lip, glancing over at the television and then back at Izuku. "I mean, obviously I think heroes are cool, it's just that, well, it's complicated, I guess." Some of Nishia's tension dissolved, replaced by a bone-deep weariness that shocked Izuku. Nishia's crossed arms looked less like a barrier and more like a hold, his own hands clutching at his sweatshirt. "How is it complicated?" The words left Izuku's mouth before he could think about them. I mean, you don't have to talk about it, you seem like you have something specific that you're referencing." Nishia managed a tired chuckle at Izuku's panic. He tilted his head back, staring up at the ceiling. "Sometimes," Nishia paused, changing his posture to look down at his hands as he sighed. "Sometimes, it just feels like being a hero is the only way that people are allowed to help each other nowadays. If you have a strong quirk, then everyone starts talking about what a good hero you would be, like it's some foregone conclusion that's not even worth mentioning. And I mean, it's not like it's the only way to help people, like doctors and the police still get their due, but it feels like the only option for me sometimes, like all the other doors have been locked out of courtesy so that I don't accidentally go through the wrong one." Izuku could feel the beginnings of tears gathering in the corners of his eyes, a horrible prickling sensation that made him wipe a harsh hand over his face. "So I guess I just don't really like to think about heroes beyond stuff like this," Nishia said, gesturing to the TV screen. "It feels too real and almost like a threat." "But don't you go to a hero's school?" Izuku asked, his throat tight. Nishia scoffed. "Not by choice, it's a security thing." "Security thing?" Izuku repeated slowly. Nishia rolled his eyes. My big brother is Kiwami Woods. And because he's been getting more popular lately and more involved with big investigations, the commission thought it would be best to put me somewhere with better security. And what schools have better security than hero schools? Nishia threw his hands in the air lazily. Whoopi. Izuku quickly squashed any feelings of awe that rose up in him at the mention of the startup hero. I bet that makes it even harder for people to accept the fact that you don't want to be a hero. Nishia had gone back to staring into the distance forlornly. But at Izuku's words, his head whipped around. It is, and Nishia said carefully. That sucks, Izuku said sympathetically. The idle screen music that was still playing from the video game looped, a jump in the track making it abundantly clear that the silence following Izuku's statement had gone on uncomfortably long. Nishia coughed into his elbow abruptly and then looked up at Izuku, his eyes shining. Do you think if my big brother and one of my close friends are pro-heroes that the commission will just assassinate me to get rid of the collateral risk? Nishia asked. Izuku barked out a surprised laugh. Nishia joined in. You can probably guess my quirk based on my brother's and my grandpa's, Nishia said, but what's your quirk? I feel like I have some kind of civic duty to make sure that your costume isn't a completely boring disaster. Based off what I've seen, you would probably just wear a black jumpsuit and call it a day. Izuku spluttered. See, come on, I'm not that bad. I have some ideas actually, and it was then that the rest of Nishia's words were processed. Right, his quirk. Izuku could feel the blood draining from his face. It was probably best just to get it over with. About my quirk, I guess you'll get a lot of creative freedom if you want to help Mei and I with my costume because I'm quirkless. You won't have to try and fit a theme. Izuku felt it was probably best to speak confidently. That would at least throw Nishia off if the other boy rightfully decided that Izuku was no longer worth his time. Nishia was silent. Wait, what? Really? Nishia spat out, his eyes wide and full of disbelief. Izuku nodded solemnly. And, you're trying to be a hero. Nishia continued. Izuku's hum was high-pitched. Fuck, Midoriya, Nishia said. Here I was complaining about locked doors and shit. Nishia shook his head. You're in a room with no doors. A grin split Nishia's face. I'm excited to watch you take a sledgehammer to that shit. He what? Yamada yelled. Aizawa rolled his eyes and kept matching up socks. They only had around half an hour before they had to leave for the staff meeting, and he was going to finish this batch of laundry before then, no matter what kind of dramatics Yamada pulled. Aizawa put a rolled-up pair of socks into the laundry basket and then shoved up his sleeve, revealing the light purple splotches on his forearm denoting the beginning of a bruise. Aizawa bared his perfectly straight teeth at his husband in some horrible imitation of a smile. It was a substantial hit. I'm proud of him, Aizawa said. Yamada finished folding a shirt and slammed it down into the basket. The little listener has come so far, he cried, throwing his head back and blinking up at the ceiling so that his tears didn't fall. Aizawa snorted. You're so dramatic, he muttered under his breath. I can't help it, Yamada wailed. He's just been trying so hard and you're the only one who gets to see it. Well, you're proctoring the recommendation exam, aren't you? You'll get to see how much he's improved then, Aizawa told Yamada. What? Aizawa's smile transformed into a smirk. What? He asked innocently. Yamada turned his entire torso so that he was facing his husband. What? He repeated, his usually energetic voice entirely flat. Aizawa shook his head in clear amusement. It's simple, he started to explain. Izuku didn't apply to any hero schools, but he was made to be a hero, so I'm going to get him into a hero school. Aizawa shrugged as he sorted through the pile of clothing for the match to a black and white striped sock. You know I want Izuku to become a hero just as much as you do, Yamada began, but is UA really the best place for him? It's so competitive there, and he'll be the first quirkless kid to ever be in the UA hero program. As soon as word about that gets out, the media will storm the place and there might be protests. Yamada cut himself off with a sharp inhale. You could apprentice him just as well while he goes to a normal high school. It would probably be much easier and Izuku could stay under the radar. Yamada finished softly. I know that UA is important to you, but you know better than anyone how limiting it can be. Aizawa threw the next roll of socks into the laundry basket with enough force that it bounced back out, landing on their carpet and rolling under the couch. UA is the best hero school in the world, he said. That's just a fact. It's been statistically proven, Hazashi. If I am going to be teaching at the best hero program in the world, then I am going to have the best student I have ever met there, or I am going to lose faith in the way that things work. Izuku needs to go to UA. It's not just because he'll get more opportunities. It's that Izuku is still so fragile. He needs to be shown that he is worthy of his goals, that he has value in the eyes of society, and not just in the eyes of a select few. He needs that Hazashi. Yamada was quiet. Aizawa watched his husband aggressively fold a pair of sweatpants. Fuck, Yamada said firmly. You're right. I know, Aizawa replied. I hate this, Yamada continued. He might not even want to go to a hero school, you know. Aizawa shrugged. Yamada narrowed his eyes, and then jolted as if struck by lightning. What about All Might? Yamada sprang from the couch, waving his arms around wildly. Isn't he supposed to be teaching this year? He's going to be at the staff meeting today. Is it really wise to put Izuku into a highly stressful environment with peers that underestimate him and a teacher who crushed his dreams? Shouta, you know I love this kid just as much as you do. I want to see him accomplish his dreams so badly, but like. Yamada waved his arms around, pacing in front of the couch while Aizawa continued folding clothes with a grim expression on his face. All Might is unfortunate, Aizawa said. However, I still think that UA is going to be the best place for Izuku to gain the skills that he needs as a quirkless hero out in the field, and I can devote more time and resources to him if he's actually one of my students. Yamada flopped down next to Aizawa and threw an arm over his eyes. It's possible he won't even react to All Might. He seems good at repression. I'm a little worried about how All Might will react though. What if he remembers Izuku and tries to say something? Izuku will not be alone with All Might. There's no way for you to guarantee that, babe. Yamada peeked out from under his arm to get a good look at his husband. A lot of people would consider Aizawa attractive. He was fit, his hair was well taken care of even if he didn't brush it as much as he should, and he was tall. Aizawa hit pretty much all of the marks for conventionally attractive, marks that got thrown out as soon as he leveled his glare on you. Then he was scary and his scruff made him look disheveled rather than rugged. Yamada loved that. It meant that he could keep how Aizawa looked right now all to himself. All the other voyeurs scared off by Aizawa's prickly exterior. Aizawa's hair was up, an old claw clip holding it all away from his neck with a few pieces escaping to frame his face. It was the kind of hairstyle that got better the longer you wore it. Aizawa's head was bowed, his eyes focused on the long-sleeved undershirt that he was folding. His neck created a curve that Yamada wanted to run his hand over. All of this paled in comparison to his expression. From his point of view, Yamada could only see part of Aizawa's face. His mouth was turned down at the corner, displeased and grim and kissable. The eye that he could see was lit aflame with determination. It was the kind of look that Aizawa wore when he was picked for rescue work instead of reconnaissance. It was the look that made Yamada think that he was lucky to be married to an entirely different creature than him. A creature that needed justice like Yamada needed oxygen. Yamada pitied All Might at that moment. Never mind, Yamada said, waving the arm that had been over his face in the air lazily to clear away the haze of bloodlust. I can see that's not going to be a problem. Aizawa nodded. How do you know Izuku will even agree to a recommendation though? With his mental health being where it is right now, he might see that as a handout. Yamada asked. That is also not going to be a problem, Aizawa replied. Shouta, Yamada said, trepidation practically dripping from the name. What are you planning? Aizawa collected the last pair of socks from the basket and rolled them into a ball before placing it into the now full laundry basket. If he doesn't know he's applying, there will be no way for him to sabotage himself. Yamada blinked. What does that even mean? He whispered incredulously. That's for me to know and for you to stay quiet about during the meeting, Aizawa replied, getting up from the couch and heading toward the door. Yamada followed, putting the laundry basket onto the dining table as they passed it. Fine, I'll stay out of your weird plans and ruses or whatever you like to call them. Just be careful not to put Izuku on Netsu's interesting list. Yamada shoved his feet into his shoes as he spoke, getting ready to head out. If Aizawa was the kind of man to shiver dramatically like Yamada was, he would have shivered dramatically. Thankfully, he was not, so in response he just nodded. Nimiri met them at the front of the school. She had her hair pulled back, and upon catching sight of Aizawa and Yamada, she pointed a finger at Aizawa. It was always slightly odd to catch Midnight out of her hero costume. Her personal style showed a lot less skin than her hero persona would have you believe. There was still an amount of skin shown though, demonstrated by the way her oversized shirt exposed her shoulders and collarbones. Same hairstyle, she shouted gleefully, walking forward to meet them halfway and aligning herself next to them on the large sidewalk, placing Aizawa in the middle of an excitable people sandwich, arguably his least favorite place to be. Same hairstyle, Yamada shouted back, because Aizawa wouldn't have. Nimiri slung an arm across Aizawa's shoulders. How do you think Netsu always manages to schedule the staff meetings during our days off? He probably hacks into our agency's scheduling system and changes it to match up with what he wants us to do, Aizawa responded with deadly certainty. Nimiri laughed, her shoulders bouncing up and down. She slapped his back, forcing him to take a half step forward so that he didn't fall from the force. Yeah, probably, she replied. They met a few of the other teachers in the hallway, all of them grouping up together to walk toward the giant conference room where the heroics department usually held their meeting. As usual, when they walked in, Netsu was already sitting at the head of the table, with a stack of papers set neatly in front of him. The teachers all shuffled into their chairs, some people filing in right when the meeting was supposed to start and jogging to their seats. Netsu began the meeting at exactly the time he said it was going to begin. It was a routine meeting. They discussed the lunch menu, bell schedules, field trips, summer camps, uniform distribution, budgeting, entrance exam tweaks. It was the same every year, but the meeting lasted around 2 hours because they were heroes and heroes had to have an opinion on everything, apparently. As usual, Aizawa and a few other teachers argued with Nezu for half an hour about the entrance exam. Nimuri and Snipe campaigned for weapon training the first years. Lunch Rush got to wax poetic about food for 15 minutes. And Nezu made all the final decisions. They were wrapping up, some of the teachers anxiously checking their watches and gathering their things, when Nezu clapped his hands together. Now, Nezu said, we only have one last thing to discuss. Everyone except for the heroics teachers directly involved with hero instruction are free to go. Yamada frowned as he scooted back his chair to leave the room, sending Aizawa a meaningful look. Aizawa moved over so that he was seated between 13 and Snipe. Everyone that was still in the room shifting to be closer to the head of the table. A tall, thin man with blonde hair got up and stood next to Nezu, his hands clasped in front of him. Aizawa had never seen this man before. He was probably one of the new teachers, maybe foreign language if he had to guess, that had something to say to Nezu before he left. All right, Yagi-san, all the people in this room are completely trustworthy. You can go ahead now, Nezu said. The rat reached out his paw to pat Yaga's hand. Aizawa had a distinctly bad feeling. It was a blink and you'll miss it kind of moment. 1 second an anxious emancipated man stood in front of them and the next it was All Might. Aizawa did not blink. He just stared. This was unexpected, 13 remarked, their expression masked by the reflective space helmet that they wore. Yep, Snipe said. The heroic instruction staff watched as All Might, the number one hero, deflated. Nezu's beady black eyes shined with mirth. All Might, or Yagi, coughed into a handkerchief that he pulled from the pockets on his oversized cargo pants. Aizawa saw a faint pink stain seep through to the other side of the fabric as the number one hero shoved the handkerchief back into his pocket. A few years ago, Nezu began, all eyes in the room swinging toward him, all but Aizawa's who were still trained on All Might's expression. Yagi-san sustained a career-ruining injury, though he did not let it ruin his career. The injury changed the way his quirk functioned. Nezu explained, he has a time limit that he can be transformed and as his co-workers, we must help All Might manage this limit and keep his more vulnerable identity a secret. As far as anyone outside of this room is concerned, Yagi-san and All Might are two completely different people. All Might is a new heroics course instructor, and Yagi-san is an urban battle strategy consultant helping us with designing a new arena for training. Do you all understand? The crowd nodded. All Might rubbed the back of his pencil-thin neck with one of his giant hands. I apologize for forcing you all to keep this secret from me. Nezu seemed to think it would aid in my work here if some people knew about my condition, Yagi said. Snipe was the first to speak. It's all right, partner. We all have our scars from work. I look forward to working with you. The smile that Yagi gave them seemed like a pale imitation of All Might's, uncanny in its resemblance but different in the most important ways. Recovery Girl is, of course, also aware of Yagi-san's condition, Nezu said, finally standing from the table, so if you have any concerns or questions you can direct them to Yagi-san as well as Recovery Girl. How long is your time period? Aizawa asked bluntly. Oh, Yagi turned toward Aizawa. That is important, isn't it? I'm currently at 5 hours of transformation time, but that is expected to dwindle as time goes on. Aizawa nodded. I look forward to working with you, Eraserhead. Yagi said, I really admire your work. Thank you, Aizawa replied. He then turned on his heel to follow Nezu back to the principal's office. The wind generated by the motion made Yaga's hair strands flutter behind him. Aizawa felt like someone had pulled a rug out from under his feet, and underneath the rug was ice. It was impossible not to fall. And when he righted himself, it was on the other side of the ice. He could see through it to how the world was supposed to work, but he didn't have a strong enough tool to pierce through the layer of frost that separated him from it. That, however, wasn't currently important. He could figure out how his world worked later. Right now he was trying to get Izuku onto the right side of the ice. Yamada gave him another look over Nimuri's shoulder as he passed the two of them, on the verge of catching up to Nezu. Aizawa shook his head. Yamada nodded. Later, he was now walking right next to the principal. They rounded a few corners before Nezu spoke. Shouta-kun, I hope that you're not about to ask me if you can share the top secret information you just learned in that staff meeting with Hisashi, because I know that he's your husband, but this topic is much too sensitive for. Nezu paused. Oh, he said, turning his head more fully toward Aizawa, eyes searching the man's face. That wasn't what you were going to ask. No, Aizawa confirmed. I think it would be best to speak about it in your office. I have some materials I need to show you. All right, Nezu allowed. They both had tea when the conversation resumed. I have a personal student that I would like to recommend, Aizawa said, taking a sip of his tea afterward. Why not go through the official recommendation channels? Nezu asked immediately. Midoriya, Aizawa said, Izuku's surname feeling odd as it left his mouth. Had it really been so long since he thought of Izuku that way? As a unique student, In what way? Nezu asked. This was the dangerous part of the conversation. Aizawa pulled out his phone. He had created a document with a few recordings of Izuku's training and pictures of Izuku's hero notes in preparation for this. Let me download a few files onto your computer. Nezu's eyes were glued to the screen. The analysis in front of his was rudimentary, but it held promise. A promise made up of organized charts and color-coded diagrams and anatomically correct drawings of heroes with critiques on their costumes. It was a wondrous promise that made Nezu's claws twitch toward his keyboard to take notes on the notes in front of him. What did the young analyst really mean when he said that Midnight's costume change was disadvantageous? Why was there such a heavy focus on long-distance combat opportunities for the water horses? Why was the pen pressure different when the analyst wrote about Shock Knock's fighting style than when he wrote about the hero's costume? What had shaped such an adept analyst? An analyst who wrote like the information on the page would save them one day, like they needed to memorize it, like they needed to find all of the flaws and all of the strengths of a hero and break them apart until they were nearly unrecognizable. Nezu wanted to dissect the pages in front of him in the same way, tear the words from the paper and turn them over until he could see all of the dimensions that Aizawa's student had put into his words. The training videos were impressive too. The child had clearly grown greatly over the course of his training. His form was almost flawless in the last video that Aizawa had shown Nezu. There was a persistence and intelligence that was immediately noticeable in how the child fought. He would be amazing, except he doesn't have a quirk, does he? No, Aizawa said. But are hoping that his analysis is impressive enough to get him into UA. Nezu questioned. It is impressive enough. Nezu smiled. And you know that because you handpicked the ones that were just impressive enough for me to consider him. Aizawa took a sip of his tea and kept his gaze unwaveringly on Nezu. You are right. Nezu continued. I am impressed. You just overlooked something. What was that? Aizawa asked. In this analysis, your student mentions that he's impressed with what the heroes have shown so far, meaning that these analyses were written when said hero debuted, meaning that what you've shown me isn't the work of a middle schooler, but an elementary student. Nezu picked up his teacup and watched Aizawa tense. Nezu felt excited. The idea of a quirkless elementary schooler spending his free time tearing heroes apart on a professional level was. It's intriguing to wonder what the boy could be capable of now, Nezu continued, taking delight in the way Aizawa seemed to be fighting against a panic response. Which is why he should be allowed to take the recommendation exam under my supervision, Aizawa said, in a foolish gambit to regain control of the conversation. Oh, of course he will be allowed to take the recommendation exam. Nezu waved a paw in the air to dismiss any thoughts otherwise. In fact, I would be severely disappointed if he didn't. Why are you asking to supervise, though, Shouta-kun? Aizawa gritted his teeth. There is a possibility. He admitted that if Midoriya knew that he was taking the recommendation exam, his performance would be much worse. He didn't actually apply to UA. How interesting, Nezu responded. I will allow you to personally supervise. You said Midoriya, didn't you? Midoriya's examination. Aizawa relaxed. On one condition, Nezu continued, unplugging Aizawa's phone from his computer and handing the device back. I will receive copies of the rest of your student's analysis and be the one to conduct his interview. On the down low, of course. Nezu winked. Aizawa, if he squinted, could see the devil horns curling around Nezu's ears. Half, Aizawa countered. 2/3, and I'll keep his status as a recommended student a secret. Hand met paw as they shook on it. Bakugo Katsuki ground his teeth together as he stomped through the hallway. Each thump of his foot against the ground helped calm him, a cathartic release found in the sound that echoed around the house and the vibrations that echoed through his bones. When he reached the door, he stilled, running a hand down his shirt to smooth it out. He was Bakugo Katsuki. He could handle any shit that Deku threw at him tonight. Looking through the frosted glass window, Katsuki could see the short blurry figures of the Midoriya. His hand already had the doorknob in a vice-like grip, ready to wrench open the door and welcome Auntie and Deku into their home. But right before Katsuki was going to make his move, Deku's voice filtered through the wood. Katsuki only caught the tail end of Deku's sentence, but the tone had him instinctively shift so that he was ducking under the window, hidden from their eyes. Or the beach. Deku was nervous. Katsuki could hear the way that Auntie's eyebrows drew down in confused concern even while he focused on making sure his hand was still where it rested on the doorknob. Why not, baby? I'm not finished yet and I feel like it might make things complicated. I haven't told Kaken about anything yet. Katsuki had to bite the inside of his cheek to keep from clicking his tongue. There goes Deku, pretending that they're friends again. Not that he wasn't about to do the exact same thing. But I'm so proud of you. Inko insisted. I want to tell Mitsuki all about all this work you've put in. You've been trying so hard, Izuku. Deku cut Auntie off. Please, Mom. There was a desperation there that Katsuki doubted Auntie would be able to say no to. He was proven right when, after a long sigh, Auntie conceded. This was followed by a light knock. Katsuki shifted back a step so that his silhouette still wouldn't be visible through the frosted glass, and then waited a few seconds before wrenching the door all the way open in one go. Deku flinched, predictably, and Auntie opened her arms for a hug, smiling brightly at Katsuki. The hug was warm and soft and so completely unlike the hugs that Katsuki got from his own mother that Katsuki instantly relaxed and returned the embrace. He briefly glared at Deku over Inko's shoulder before turning his face into her cardigan. Hugs at the Bakugo household were brash, aggressive things. They were arms clutching at each other in pats that left stinging red marks with their comfort. They were loud things, declarations of love or pride and contested shouting. It was just how they were. Sometimes Katsuki envied Deku. He loved the old hag, but they were similar in a lot of ways that didn't lend them to gentle moments. The Midoriya household, from what Katsuki could remember of play dates that seemed ages ago, was very soft. Soft carpet, soft couches, food that was easy to enjoy, and people that spoke quietly but passionately. Sometimes during class, when Katsuki was particularly bored or distracted, he would find himself looking at Izuku's hair, at the way he turned the ruined pages of his textbooks, at how he carefully wrote in his journals, at how his eyes would turn gentle and happy when he got a good grade or was reading a good article, and Katsuki would think, soft, first absent-mindedly, and then viciously, soft, fragile, weak. Then he would corner Deku after class and watch as Izuku's weak frame shook and trembled and bled. He always felt better after that. Deku was weak and Katsuki was strong. These were the facts of their existence. It had been true even before Deku was diagnosed as quirkless, and it would forever be true afterward. There was no way such a useless weak person could ever be stronger than Katsuki. This is why it pissed him off when he pulled back and noticed Deku was wearing an oversized hoodie. As fucking if he could keep hiding whatever the fuck he was doing from Katsuki. There was always a period of time before dinner when Auntie and his mom would banish Deku and Katsuki to his room. This is when he would strike. "Come on, nerd," Katsuki grunted, gesturing toward the stairs. "All right, Kaken," Deku was smiling. Katsuki hated his fucking smiles. Bright and happy and completely convincing. "You boys have fun," Auntie said, already wandering further into the house to watch Mitsuki finish the last of dinner and gossip before they had the children as an audience to their conversation. Katsuki's room was cleaner than one would expect of a boy like him. One who shouted more than he spoke and hit more than he held. Things were in their place, the place that Katsuki had chosen, and everything was well taken care of. His weights were set in a neat pyramid in the corner, his bed was made with a corner turned down stylishly, and his limited edition posters were properly framed. "Sit," Katsuki growled as soon as Deku had made it into the room. Katsuki held the door open for Deku, looming over him as Izuku hitched his shoulders up toward his ears. Katsuki slammed the door afterward, his mother's shouting over the action drowned out by the walls between them. Deku sat at Katsuki's desk chair, perched on the edge with his hands held together tightly in front of him. The nerd was picking at his cuticles, and Katsuki watched as Deku pulled a thin piece of skin off his pointer finger and a tiny drop of blood rushed to fill the depression. Katsuki desperately wanted to hit something. The last time that he and Izuku talked had been months ago. Deku doesn't get to keep this shit from him any longer. "I know about the beach," Katsuki began, a grin curling around the words. If Izuku wasn't going to be forthcoming, then Katsuki could make him. Katsuki expected some kind of visceral reaction to his words. Maybe the nerd would pale, or his fidgeting would still or speed up, or he might start spluttering. Deku didn't do any of that shit. Katsuki searched Izuku's expression, but all that he could find was a carefully manufactured fear. Deku's expression remained the same as before. His hands did not still or speed up. He didn't pale. He didn't try to leave. Deku seemed as if he hadn't heard Katsuki at all. Katsuki wasn't one for silence. He had already placed his bets. So now he had to go all in. "Are you gonna say anything?" Katsuki growled. He racked his brain for anything else vaguely threatening but specific enough to seem like he knew something. Anything about what Deku was up to. Before Katsuki could think of anything, Deku replied, "No." "What?" Katsuki barely managed to suppress the scream of rage into a gravelly whisper. Deku looked up from his hands and met Katsuki's eyes. Katsuki felt a chill run through him. Izuku was still wearing that fear, the twitchy fear that Katsuki was used to seeing. But his eyes were it was like he was looking through Katsuki. "No, I'm not going to say anything," Deku said, abruptly stilling. "I don't really believe that you know anything about what I do in my free time. And while we're here, you can't hurt me severely enough to make me talk without risking both of our mother's ire. So, no, I am not going to tell you what you want to know." Katsuki blinked. What the fuck? Katsuki was not the type of person to respond calmly to provocation. But something about Izuku's demeanor was making Katsuki match his energy. Katsuki crossed his arms and leaned against the door. "You do realize that you're gonna fucking pay for this shit you're pulling later, right?" "Yes," Deku replied. They were at an impasse. Katsuki flung himself onto his bed and held his phone above his head. The screen was blank, but the nerd didn't need to know that. Katsuki had to come up with a plan. before Deku had started slinking around and disappearing all the fucking time. It was easy to corner him. A well-timed collision on the way home, closing the classroom door before Deku could scurry out, getting some of his lackeys to hold Deku up while he changed shoes. It was easy. It wasn't easy anymore. Deku was out of the door before the bell even rang. The teacher had scolded him at first, threatened detention, but somehow Deku had weaseled his way out of it. It was fucking infuriating. Katsuki wasn't going to leave 20 goddamn minutes early just to corner Deku. He had to figure out where the fucker was going and corner him there. Luckily for Katsuki, there was only one beach within walking distance. But why would Deku be hanging out at a garbage dump? Deku had settled down into Katsuki's desk chair and was typing away at something on his phone. Katsuki hated this. He hated that Deku was in his room. He hated that he was fucking relaxing. He hated that Deku was keeping information from him as if he didn't have a goddamned right to know what that idiot was doing. Izuku wasn't better than him. He was quirkless and soft and weak, and the fact that he thought he could keep things from Katsuki with no consequences was slowly driving Katsuki insane. Deku was training, that much was apparent. He had muscles, he moved differently. He even had a minuscule amount of confidence. If Deku thought that he could be a hero, he was sorely mistaken. Only people like Katsuki could be heroes, people who were strong. Deku would never be stronger than him. Katsuki's phone case creaked under his white-knuckled grip. Never. Dinner with the Bakugus was a double-edged sword for Izuku. On one hand, he got to see Aunt Mitsuki, and Bakugo had to be, at least, civil. On the other hand, the fact that Kaken was bound by his mother's adoration of his childhood friend clearly got on the explosive teenager's nerves. So, it was oddly nice. After Kaken's confrontation in his bedroom, Izuku had escaped down to dinner and spent the rest of the evening laughing and getting his hair ruffled by Mitsuki, who gushed about how cute and polite he was compared to her son. Masaru ate quietly, smiling at Izuku when Mitsuki's ruffles got a tad too aggressive. Inko behaved similarly, asking Kaken about his training and how he was preparing for the UA entrance exam. After dinner, Izuku offered to do the dishes, and as was tradition, Kaken joined him. It was weird. When they were together as two families, there were all these habits that Izuku fell back into. Habits born from a childhood of wanting to be around each other. Kaken dried the dishes while Izuku washed them. They hung out in Kaken's room before dinner. After dinner, they sat next to each other on the couch while their parents talked over a movie and had dessert. It was the principle of proximity in reverse. Instead of becoming friends due to their closeness, they were slowly falling apart, even while they sat next to each other, their thighs touching and their elbows brushing as they ate their cake and stared at the television. Izuku found himself thinking of Katsuki not as a friend or a bully, but a particularly annoying cousin that he only saw on special occasions. Mei and Nishio were Izuku's friends. His classmates were his bullies. Katsuki was something different. Izuku loved him. Izuku used to love him. Katsuki was shining and bright and loud and wonderful. And then he was bright and loud and he hurt. And now he was bright and loud and in the background. Izuku took another bite of his cake. It was chocolate with sliced almonds pressed to the sides. It was good. At some point over the last few months, Katsuki had fallen off of Izuku's radar. It was surreal, now that he was thinking about it. Even after Katsuki had stopped being Izuku's friend and turned into something cruel and harsh, Izuku had, in the back of his mind, still thought of Katsuki. Where was he going to be? What would he do first? Was the test score going to set him off? Should Izuku try and calm him down or in now? Now he mostly thought about getting to his lessons with Aizawa on time and remembering to respond to his friends' texts. And sometimes deep dark water and floating and nothing, but that was only sometimes. Izuku knew. He knew that Katsuki was going to become a hero. He knew that he would be bright and shining and loud and wonderful, and that he would save people and defeat villains, and that he would smile. Izuku didn't need to be there for that. He didn't even need to see it happen. Izuku couldn't keep protecting Katsuki. He couldn't be the target anymore. Mei and Nishio would worry. Aizawa would figure out who Izuku's bully was, and Kaken would lose his chance. Katsuki needed to grow up and handle his fucking issues. Izuku's teeth collided violently with his fork as he took his next bite of cake. Aizawa was out of breath. He struck out at Izuku again with his capture weapon and watched gleefully as Izuku hopped over it nimbly. They had been at it for at least an hour. An entire hour. Something warm and proud was blooming in Aizawa's chest, making it hard for him to breathe, though that also might have been due to the fact that they had been sparring for an hour and change. Aizawa was efficient. He usually ended battles far more quickly. Izuku had just become that slippery. Aizawa sent out another strand of his scarf and sprinted toward Izuku at the same time, a full frontal assault. Izuku twisted to the side, but kept the balls of his feet solidly on the ground so that when Aizawa was right in front of him, Izuku ducked under a punch and then jumped, placing his hands on Aizawa's shoulders to brace himself. Izuku launched himself over the hero to unbalance him. The combined force of his and Izuku's weights hurtling toward the ground was too much for Aizawa to be able to catch himself, ensuring that the pro slammed into the mats. Izuku's hand grabbed one of Aizawa's wrists, surely going for a restraining hold. As if, kid, Aizawa jerked his hand out of the hold. Used to close encounters with villains whose grip was usually much more desperate and crushing than Izuku's grasp, he attempted to roll away from Izuku, but the kid slammed down onto his legs, holding them stationary beneath his body weight. Hands fumbled for his arms again, straining this time since Aizawa was in a fully seated position. If Izuku was slightly taller, he might have been able to pull it off. Aizawa tilted his head back so that he could see his student's hand reaching for his, then grabbed it. Izuku let out an eep of surprise as he was pulled forward and Aizawa escaped from his hold, retreating across the room to put some distance between himself and his opponent. Izuku was panting, so covered in sweat that his hair was dripping with it, the green curls plastered to his forehead. Aizawa could tell that his student was reaching his limit. In a few minutes Izuku would make a mistake and Aizawa would pin him, but Izuku had gotten close. Aizawa was sure that they were almost at the point where Izuku had to start sparring with other people or risk developing bad habits. Izuku had a rock-solid understanding of the basics and he had good instincts. There wasn't much else that Aizawa could teach him, fighting-wise, without involving other people. Aizawa was tempted to bring in Hisashi or Nimuri, but wasn't sure how Izuku would respond to either of them. They might have to change what they spent the majority of their time on. Izuku had already mastered most of the free-running jumps that Aizawa had set him on. But that wasn't the same as real-world practice, just like how sparring with Aizawa over and over again wasn't the same as facing street fighters or multiple opponents at once. The only problem with that was that it would entail taking Izuku up to high places and watching the kid launch himself off buildings. That might be a problem for both of them. Izuku was tentatively coming closer to him, moving across the ring in a wide arc, waiting for Aizawa to make an offensive move. Aizawa stayed still. Izuku made an annoyed face at him. Aizawa suppressed the urge to smile. Izuku continued his creeping circle, forcing Aizawa to spin around to keep Izuku within his field of vision. When he was within striking distance, Izuku threw a punch at Aizawa's stomach from the right. Aizawa went to block, but at the last second Izuku's closed fist turned into an open palm and his hand wrapped around Aizawa's forearm, pulling it down so that Izuku's opposite knee could ram into his kidney. Izuku leaned back, pulling on Aizawa's arm with almost all his weight to keep him close and keep the arm out of the way. Aizawa starts tilting forward to unbalance him, but Izuku is already dancing backward, out of reach. Aizawa follows, sending out a piece of his capture scarf and preparing another one to intercept Izuku when he dodges, only for Izuku to trip over himself and land in a tangled pile at his feet. Aizawa couldn't help it. He snickered. Aizawa gripped his capture scarf and reeled Izuku toward him, crouching over the boy and meeting his eyes. Izuku was pouting and red-faced from exertion. Sorry, Izuku began, hands working quickly in an attempt to untangle himself. You did well, Aizawa told him. He pushed away Izuku's hands so that he wouldn't make more of a mess. Aizawa ruffled Izuku's hair with one hand and pulled on his capture scarf with the other, effortlessly unraveling knots that Izuku had unknowingly put into place with his struggling. At this point, you're probably gonna outrank all the kids in your class, Aizawa said with a fond smile on his face as he helped Izuku stand up. Izuku raised an eyebrow at him. I should hope so. I mean, it's not like I'm going to a school full of gang members or something. The kid giggled, dusting off his pants and heading toward the water cooler. Aizawa blinked. He sat down next to Izuku on the bench. I know you didn't apply to UA, but there's still time for you to apply to other hero schools. Their deadlines are usually after UAS so they can snatch up anyone with promise who didn't make it, Aizawa said slowly. Izuku blinked. You do want to go to a hero school, don't you? Aizawa asked gently. Izuku tensed and untensed within the span of a second. I guess. I'm not really sure honestly. Aizawa watched Izuku pick at a scab on his finger. It would be difficult, I think, Izuku continued, peeking up at Aizawa from under his bangs. Not because of, training or anything, but because oh well, I would probably be the only quirkless person there and that's a lot of pressure. Izuku said it like it was a question and not a factual statement that was undeniably true. If you think I really should, I wouldn't mind. I'm not going to make you go to a hero school, Aizawa said. He moved to stand in front of Izuku and shoved his hands into his pockets. But you need to seriously consider the benefits of more in-depth training, experts in different fields, unlimited access to equipment and on-staff medical care, curriculum designed to help you be prepared for your career, and usually good food because hero schools are overfunded by the government. Izuku rattled off. Yes, Aizawa said. I know the benefits, Izuku said. But this way is just easier, isn't it? I can just keep apprenticing under you and take the licensing exam under your recommendation. Or something. Izuku was mumbling by the end. Aizawa frowned. If that's what you really want. It's just that you wouldn't be there if I went to another school, and you're the only one who's ever. I just mean you. You support me, and I'm not sure if anyone else would really think I can do it, and if you're not there and May's not there and Nishia's not there, then I'll probably believe them. Especially if I went to Shiksu or something, because that's a boarding school. Kid, Aizawa said gruffly, stopping Izuku's rant in its tracks. Just keep thinking about it, okay? I'm going to make sure everything works out, I promise. Izuku took a big drink of water. I'll look into some of the other schools, Izuku said, but I can't promise anything because you and also Yue it was my dream, and being a hero was your dream too, wasn't it? Aizawa asked calmly. And you're taking that back, so keep your mind open, Izuku. Izuku shrugged. Aizawa sighed. How would you feel about replacing a few of your sparring sessions with a more practical application of your free-running skills? Aizawa-sensei. Izuku, Aizawa-sensei, you have to stop using illegal sources to find information for your villain analysis. I can only overlook so much hacking. Midoriya Izuku. It's the only way to get good footage of the villains fighting though. The news only shows high-profile villains, and it's always just the hero highlight reel without showing the actual struggle. Aizawa-sensei, I understand that, but I have contacts within the police department. You can just ask me to request the footage if you need more. You don't have to hack in and force me to tell them that apparently a skilled middle schooler can get through their security. Midoriya Izuku. To be fair, it took me a while to do it the first time. Aizawa-sensei, do I even want to know? Midoriya Izuku. I go on a lot of analysis and news forums. People know things on there, and as a moderator, people are usually pretty willing to help me with anything they can. Aizawa-sensei, you scare me sometimes, kid. Izuku laughed at his phone, shoving it back into his pocket. He was moving a tire, the third out of 5 that he was planning on moving today. The sand crunched underneath his tennis shoes, and he had to dig his feet in to get leverage, which was making the grains go into his socks. It sucked, but Izuku only had a few more piles of large things to muscle off of the beach before it would all be done. He had the top half of a car, a few washing machines, and a mattress scheduled for today after he got all the tires off the beach. After that, it would only take him, maybe 2, probably 3 weeks to clean up the rest of the beach, and then he would have to let Nishia know that he was ready for whatever plans his grandfather had. Izuku was entertaining the idea of having a kind of party at the beach when he finally finished everything up. He could make a cake and invite his friends for his mom to meet. Izuku had never had a real birthday party. He took cake to his classmates. His mom bought him gifts and sang to him. Sometimes Aunt Mitsuki would send Katsuki over with a card and a sweater that she thought would suit him, but never anything resembling the celebrations that Izuku sometimes heard his peers speak so gleefully about. After he was diagnosed as quirkless, Izuku had only tried for a real party once. It was during the 3rd grade, the year of running, and Haga-sensei refusing to look him in the eye. He discreetly handed out invitations at lunch to his nicer classmates, the ones who smiled at him when he came in the room and preferred to keep to themselves instead of teasing him. Not a single one of them came. Looking back, Izuku chalked it up to diffusion of responsibility. They saw him handing out invitations and thought, surely someone will go to the quirkless kid's birthday party. Human beings aren't that cruel, are they? And if someone was going to go, then they didn't have to. 5 RSVPs resulted in leftover cake and pizza in the Midoriya's fridge for a week. Izuku wasn't naive enough to try again the next year. It was different now. It wasn't going to be his birthday, for one thing, and he had friends who cared about him. May and Izuku texted daily, and Nishia had forced him to download Snapchat so they could exchange pictures every day. Nishia said that he wanted Izuku to be his longest streak. And while Izuku wasn't entirely sure what that meant, he was happy to do it if it made his friend happy. His mom would be ecstatic to finally meet the people he had been spending so much time with. And Ko and Aizawa were already getting along almost scarily well, so Izuku could only imagine how she and Asami would interact. He was definitely looking forward to it. It felt odd to be planning something so far ahead after months of living just day to day, but it was nice. It was the opposite of how he used to think about his life, just cycling through sleeping and going to school and being miserable. Izuku kind of liked being alive when he had friends and mentors and maybe achievable goals. He was on the 4th tire now, pushing it through the path that he had carved through the sand toward the ramp that he had made out of the car door. He was halfway through the trail when he lost his hold. The tire tilted to the side, and before Izuku could prevent it from tipping over, it was crashing down in the sand, sending grains flying and scraping his hands against the aged rubber. Izuku cursed under his breath, crouching down in the sand to push the tire upright. The sand bit into his knees, prickly. He had just gotten his fingertips underneath the edge of the tire when he finally looked up to see Katsuki standing at the top of the stone stairs. Izuku's first thought wasn't anything. It should have been like, oh no, or fuck, or I should start running. It was, he doesn't belong here. Katsuki wasn't supposed to be here. The beach was Izuku's. He was cleaning it. He had cared for it. He had spent hours upon hours upon hours trekking through the sand and throwing out trash and just existing in a way that he couldn't anywhere else. The beach was his and Bakugo Katsuki standing on the stained concrete steps that Izuku was planning on scrubbing at some point felt like an anomaly. At any moment the sky would split open at its seams, fire would rain down, and the ground would shake because this was indisputably wrong. Katsuki was wearing a black tank top and track pants, the kind of outfit that he usually wore to run. But surely a monumental fuck-up of the universe like the one that was currently occurring wasn't because of a wrong turn at a well-known jogging route. No, Izuku knew that Katsuki had come here on purpose, probably puzzled that there was really only one beach within walking distance, even if that distance was especially large. Katsuki had a sort of shocked look on his face. It was an expression that Izuku was unfamiliar with, as Katsuki was not often caught off guard. Izuku slowly unwedged his fingers from underneath the tire and stood up. It didn't bring him level with Katsuki because of the height of the stairs, but the distance between them gave Izuku at least the impression of equal footing. It was this that made Izuku speak first. "What are you doing here, Katsuki?" Katsuki stopped looking over the empty expanse of the beach and met Izuku's eyes. His expression hardened. "Did you do this?" he asked. Izuku knew that there was no right answer to the question. Katsuki was here and that was wrong, so anything Izuku said was going to be wrong too. Izuku felt mad. For once in his life, Katsuki couldn't keep his nose out of Izuku's business, and wasn't that ironic? The blonde always told Izuku to leave him alone and stop following him around, and now here Katsuki was, tracking Izuku down to figure out exactly what he was doing. The worst part was that Izuku knew Katsuki would be mad too. Izuku was being trained by a pro hero. Sure, it was a hero that Katsuki had probably never heard of, and yes, it was partly because Izuku was on a suicide watch due in large part to Katsuki's action. But, oh no, it was all Izuku's fault. It was his fault for being born without a quirk. It was his fault that he wanted to help people. It was his fault that he was smart when he really shouldn't be, because the people who were actually going to be something needed the top spot more than he did. It was all Izuku's fault. He should know not to get in the way or aspire for things or want. Izuku was, maybe, a little bit bitter. "Yeah," he finally answered Katsuki. "Fucking hell," Katsuki growled, sweeping an arm out in front of him, gesturing to the clean expanse of beach that used to be covered in garbage. Izuku didn't want to do what Katsuki wanted him to do. He didn't want to cower or tremble or apologize. Izuku wanted to be left alone, or he wanted to be praised for what he was doing instead of Katsuki's reaction. Shocked and disgusted, condemning. "Well," Izuku began, feeling the danger in his words and drawing them out properly like the way fight scenes in movies are sometimes in slow motion. "First, I sorted out most of the recyclables, and then..." Katsuki's eyes caught fire, as did one of his hands, an irritated explosion echoing down the cove. He rushed down the stairs toward Izuku, kicking up sand. "You know that's not what I mean, you fucking..." Izuku stepped to the side at the last possible second. Katsuki, expecting an impact, went down hard in the sand, cutting off his angry tirade. Izuku looked down at Katsuki. Katsuki glared up at him. They were both sweaty and covered in sand now. Izuku could feel the fight brewing between them. It was unmistakable. The air was practically vibrating. At any minute, lightning would strike the sand and thunder would signal the beginning of the first round. In this corner is Bakugo Katsuki, 172 centimeters, and full of Helping him out in this match is his quirk called Explosion and years of physical training to help him hone that quirk. He also has some experience with MMA fighting before he got kicked out of the dojo for excessive use of force. In the other corner is Midoriya Izuku, 165 centimeters, and just a little fed up with life. Izuku hasn't been practicing his skills for quite as long as all Katsuki, but what he lacks in quantity he makes up for in quality. Izuku has been studying the art of baguaging for around 9 months now and has been tireless. Haha, get it, because he's been moving a lot of tires in his efforts to clean the beach that has become our sparring grounds for today, building up some substantial muscle in the process. Both of our fighters have a lot at stake. Whoever loses today's match will walk away changed, though the same can probably be said for the winner. When Izuku had started his work today, he had been thankful for the cloud cover. It kept the sand from getting unbearably hot while he dug around in it. Now he felt like he should have taken the sign for what it was, literally. There was going to be a storm. As Katsuki lay on the ground, staring at Izuku like he didn't know who the boy was. As Izuku took a step back, not to retreat, but to settle his footing in the uneven sand, small drops of rain began to fall. You could barely call it rain, just a sprinkling of water over them that foretold of larger droplets to come. A flare signal saying, "You can still get inside and be spared." Neither of them moved a muscle. Katsuki didn't rush his next move. He got up slowly, planting a knee in the sand and leveraging himself up with his hands. He stared at the ground even when he was back on both his feet, his expression shadowed by his hair as it became plastered to his face from the light rain. They stood facing each other for at least a minute. The speckles of water on their clothes turned into solid patches that would soon become connected as the flow of water continued. There was no thunder, but when Katsuki looked up it was clear to both of them. Izuku threw the first punch. Deku was good. It pained Katsuki to think it, but Deku was good, like actually legitimately good. His form was solid. All his strikes were thought out. He had managed to send Katsuki sprawling in the sand multiple times. It was fucking annoying. Katsuki thought he could win this fight. He had known he could win the fight. He had been training to be a hero for years. He had the perfect quirk for direct action like this. He was going to win. It was inevitable. And yet here he was, on his ass in the sand of fucking gain. The shit was sticking to him, mixing with the rainwater that was now pouring down on them and creating a paste that stuck in his hair. Katsuki spit, glaring up at Deku. That was another thing that was annoying, Deku's face. He had this look, like he didn't even know what was happening. Like he wasn't even fucking trying. All spaced out like he was sitting at his desk with nothing to do after finishing a test instead of brawling in the middle of a beach that fucker had apparently cleaned up with his bare hands. Katsuki was here, giving it his all and looking like a complete dumbass because what kind of hero was he if he couldn't even beat a weakling like Deku? Katsuki used an explosion to propel himself upward, quick enough that Izuku didn't have time to slip away like he kept doing. Katsuki would send a punch, a kick, an elbow, that he knew should have landed, and instead of hitting anything, even a block, he would meet empty air. Deku would be a half a centimeter away, a hand already raised to push against his shoulder or jab him in the throat. That had hurt like a bitch and almost sent him to the ground with enough time for Deku to pin him. But Katsuki had managed to roll away at the last second. Not all of his attacks have gone that way. He's not completely incompetent. Deku definitely has a shiner growing under his left eye. And his ribs had felt nice and solid under Katsuki's knuckles when he managed to land a punch after doing a feint with the other arm. The last attack had been a parody of what started the fight, a charge and a miss. Katsuki kept thinking that if he just went a little bit faster, put a little more power into his explosions, then he could stop Deku from slipping away. This time would be the time that they both went sprawling in the sand and Katsuki could keep Deku still enough to get a few good explosions in. So he did it again. He leapt up and kept his form perfect. The explosions were at the right angle to give him just enough speed without raising his height. The velocity was good, and Deku wouldn't know what fucking hit him. This was the one. Katsuki was better than Deku without even trying. This was going to be. Deku caught his wrist and flipped Katsuki over his shoulder. This impact was different. It felt final. This time it was Deku sending him sprawling on his back, knocking the air out of his lungs. Katsuki had kept his form perfectly. There was no way Deku could have known he was going to throw a right hook, so how? Bakugo stared up at the clouds, rain sliding down his face, and he didn't understand. Deku was above him. Katsuki could see his mouth moving, but he couldn't hear what the nerd was saying. It was only later that he would recall that it was advice to not use the same strategy over and over again. Don't charge every time you look like you're charging. Don't always start your assault with a right hook. Katsuki watched through a haze of rain as Deku left the beach, his back disappearing out of Katsuki's view. Katsuki felt like a kid again. The rain was freshwater and he was up to his knees in it, embarrassed from falling. There were thin trails of blood in the water from scrapes that he had gotten on his knees from colliding with the pebbles that lined the bottom of the river. Deku was standing in front of him, his freckled face contorted in concern, a hand held out to help Katsuki out of the ditch. There was something so horribly insulting about Izuku trying to help him. It was after he started calling him Deku and shoving him around, half waiting for Izuku to fight back. His friend who he was mean to and pushed around because he was weak, thought that he could help Katsuki. And in front of their other friends, as if Katsuki was going to accept help from the lame one in their friend group. Smacking Deku's hand away was the beginning and the end of a lot of things, but it had never been the end of them. Katsuki and Izuku. Katsuki honestly wasn't sure what to call them. He didn't like Deku, but he was around him pretty much all the time, so they were definitely something. He hated it. It was like he and Deku were stuck together. Ever since that moment that Katsuki pushed him away, the universe had decided that they were linked. Kaken and Deku. Only, Katsuki realized Deku hadn't called him Kaken. Somehow, this was the thing that pushed Katsuki to get up out of the sand and start trudging home. Deku hadn't called him Kaken, he had called him Katsuki. His mom called him Katsuki. Auntie and Co called him Katsuki. His dad called him Katsuki. Deku didn't. Deku was supposed to call him Kaken. That's how it was supposed to be. Izuku would call him Kaken and Katsuki would hate it because it was soft and it reminded him of river water, and so he would call Izuku Deku to show him that, hey, we both know exactly what this is supposed to be. He was supposed to be Kaken, and now he wasn't. It boiled Katsuki's blood that he didn't know why Deku had suddenly changed the script. They had been locked in orbit together for how fucking long, and now when Katsuki is already confused and behind, missing his cues, is when Deku decides that he can outgrow Katsuki, that he can move farther forward or completely off the track or leave Katsuki behind. Anger blooms. Not in his stomach, but in his palms. They itch as he makes his way inside and grabs a towel out of the linen closet before slamming the door to his room closed. The anger, the heat, travels from his palms through his veins until it all collides in his chest and it almost hurts. It's familiar. The tightening of his chest and the pressure, and it hurts, but it's comforting. If Deku wants to pretend that Katsuki is only Katsuki to him, he can, but Katsuki will know the truth. You can't just erase years of childhood memories. Katsuki has left his mark. Kid, Aizawa said, disbelief coloring his voice. It's nothing, Izuku said, turning his face away. I can barely even feel it, really. Aizawa raised an eyebrow and a hand to gingerly prod at the dark bruise decorating Izuku's left cheekbone. That means either that you have a worryingly high pain tolerance or you're lying, he said matter-of-factly. Izuku shrugged, looking away from his mentor toward the gates of UA. There were other kids in athletic gear walking in, and Izuku shot Aizawa a confused glance in order to change the subject. The exercise I'm having you do today is meant to gauge your progress. You'll be pitted against other people who are also being trained to be heroes by a sponsor. There is a written test and an obstacle course. I'm going to let you know your results later in the week and we can shift our regimen accordingly, Aizawa explained. Oh, Izuku said. He moved closer to Aizawa's side as they got deeper into the building and the students began to crowd the halls. He spoke quietly. And I have to do it here, with everyone. Yes, Aizawa answered. Izuku nodded and then glanced around to get a better look at the people he would apparently be competing against. He tried to remind himself that it wasn't truly a test. Aizawa wasn't going to drop him if he didn't do as well as the other hero hopefuls. This was just a progress report. It was the equivalent of taking a test on the first day of class. Everything would be fine, he told himself. Something deep in him screamed the opposite. He couldn't possibly compete with all these people who had amazing quirks and put in the same amount of effort as he did, if not more. They were going to be ahead no matter what. That was just how it worked. He didn't know how Aizawa expected him to do better than any of them. Izuku would be monumentally lucky not to place dead last. Izuku, who had only months ago given up on his dreams completely, could not even begin to think that he could be better than the rising stars that he could spot around the room. There was a surprisingly large number of students present for a progress exercise. But Izuku supposed that being trained by a pro hero could have its pressures. Izuku stared resolutely forward as he and Aizawa made their way through the hallways, a dark smudge amongst more colorful exercise clothes and flamboyant hero costumes. Out of the corner of his eye, Izuku could see Endeavor, the flame hero, lecturing passionately to someone just outside of Izuku's field of vision. In front of them, the pro hero Buzz was laughing and patting a young girl on the shoulder. Some students seemed to be by themselves. A quiet girl with a ponytail was confidently walking toward what Izuku had to assume was the testing room. Izuku was out of his depth. Aizawa could be walking with anyone right now. He could have chosen someone so much better, but Izuku just had to throw himself off a roof and catch his attention. He ruined Aizawa's chances at finding a real student, someone with a compatible quirk, someone whose quirk factor had a passive levitation effect so that they could use Aizawa's capture weapon, someone better and not broken. When they got close to the assumed testing room, Aizawa stopped. Izuku turned to face him. From here on you're going to be on your own, Aizawa said. His teacher's hands were shoved in his pockets and he was crouching down, with his shoulders hunched so that he was closer to Izuku's level. Izuku knew not to feel patronized. This was just Aizawa's way of getting closer to him. As a teacher here, and as someone impartial, I was chosen to help rank the students who participate in today's exercise, so you'll have to go home on your own. Aizawa paused and seemed to hesitate for a moment. If you don't want to talk with anyone, you don't have to. Okay, kid. Just focus on the tests and tune everything else out. Izuku nodded. He looked around at the other teenagers passing him and then met Aizawa's eyes again. I'll do my best, Aizawa-sensei, he promised. Not that that would mean much when he was up against people leagues above him, but he owed it to his teacher to give it his all no matter what, so he would. Even if it was embarrassing and futile. Even if all he did was prove how unworthy and undeserving he was of Aizawa's help. His teacher's lip twitched in the beginnings of a smile that was quickly suppressed. He rose back up to his full height and disappeared into the crowd. Izuku found a desk and sat down. Some of the other kids were talking to each other, guessing at what might be on the test. Izuku tuned them out, stared down at the wood grain and breathed. The test was almost easy, but Izuku couldn't honestly believe that he was doing well. Glancing at the people around him revealed perplexed expressions and tapping pencils. One girl was tugging on her own hair every few seconds in exasperation. Izuku was blowing it, probably. Even if it felt like he knew the answers. Even if it felt easy, it was probably just because he wasn't smart enough to realize he's falling for all the trick questions. The testing period lasted around 3 hours. Izuku finished at the 1-hour mark and then spent the rest of the time rewriting and double-checking his answers. He tried to look like he was working, so that the bored-looking man at the front of the room wouldn't think that Izuku was slacking off or cheating. When all of the tests were collected, the guy at the front of the room herded all of the students outside, down hallways and through gigantic doors until the group of teenagers was standing in front of Present Mike and what was clearly an obstacle course. The people around him were talking, so Izuku shuffled toward the back of the crowd, settling between a boy with split red and white hair and the girl with the black ponytail that he had seen before the paper test. They stood quietly at the back of the crowd while the rest of the gathered teenagers flitted around the area nervously waiting for Present Mike to finish setting up and explain the rules. The hero was fiddling with a machine at what looked to be the end of the course, most likely a device to record their times. Izuku tried not to fidget. The people on either side of him were still, the girl only looking around occasionally and the boy almost unnaturally motionless. It made Izuku twitchy, like he needed to be twice as nervous to compensate for their composure, because if they were calm about this then he should definitely be worried. They were a few yards away from the course, close enough to see parts of it but not close enough to see the end. Izuku rocked forward onto his tiptoes to see beyond the crowd. The first portion of the course was a series of slanted platforms that they would have to make their way across to get to a rope net that led up to a set of monkey bars. Izuku couldn't see much farther than that because of the way the course looped around to save space, but there was also a long stretch of empty space right before where Mike was setting up the machines, a sprint for the finish line. Izuku ended up tugging on the hem of his shirt, feeling the seams with his fingers while Mike began heading toward the group. "Hello, listeners," he shouted in typical Present Mike fashion. "Welcome to the Mike cuts himself off suddenly." Izuku felt like the hero's eyes caught on him for a second, but it was probably his imagination. Mike wouldn't recognize some kid that he and a coworker had saved from a suicide attempt 9 long months ago. Mike began again. "Welcome to the first half of the physical portion of today's events." The rest of the people quiet down as Mike talks, listening intently. "It's exactly what it looks like, folks." Mike gestures toward the obstacle course. "It's an obstacle course. You will attempt the course with 4 other participants, for time's sake, and compete for the best time overall. When you finish, there's a water station over there." Mike points toward the entrance to a building off in the distance. "And you'll sit and wait for the proctor of the next part of the yeah." For the next part, Mike gave the gathered crowd a big double thumbs up. The first group is going to be Ida Tenya, Yashimoto Ryo, Hori Shinju, and Takage Satsuna. 4 people stepped forward. A girl with dark green hair and pointed teeth, a person wearing flowery workout material, a boy with broad shoulders and what seemed to be engines on his legs, and a girl with pointed fingers that looked like they had been dipped in black paint. It was impossible to put faces to names, but Izuku had a strong suspicion that the boy with engines on his legs was Ida Tenya. The Ida family was well known for their mechanical speed quirks, and as one of the oldest hero agencies in Japan, it was almost expected of them to send their children to the most prestigious school possible. Izuku felt like he was going to throw up. He tried to pay attention. He tried to pay as much attention as he could when his vision was swimming and he could feel the nervous sweat trickling down the back of his neck, but it was hard. Mike yelled for the 4 to start after allowing them all to stretch out and clicked a timer, most likely activating the machines at the finish line. All Izuku could really gather from his vantage point was that the boy with engines was incredibly fast and the girl with dark green hair was almost unnaturally cunning with her path. He couldn't see. The course was looped around itself and some obstacles blocked others. Izuku would get a flash of silver or green or pink, an impression of the way they were moving, and then they would disappear behind a support pillar. This trend continued with the next group of people who went up, and the group after that, and the group after that. Izuku could barely even see what quirks the participants had before they had gotten themselves over the rope net. The girl with the ponytail seemed like she had some kind of creation quirk. But without seeing the process up close, Izuku was unsure if it was really creation or something closer to manifesting items or pulling tools out of some kind of storage. It was only when he found himself at the starting line that the powerhouse quirks made their appearance. Because of course Izuku would be racing against the 2 people most likely to make a mess of the obstacle course. That was probably why they were in the last group of participants. Izuku felt like he should be cursing someone. Maybe God or Present Mike or another random UA teacher for putting the quirkless student with this group, but he half expected things like this to happen at this point. Todoroki Shoto, Yurashi Inasa, Midoriya Izuku, and Sira Natsuki. "You guys are up," Present Mike shouted. The other 3 students were already moving from their positions toward the starting line. The boy with split hair and a tall boy with a shaved head had gotten into some kind of argument right before their turn. The split-haired boy seemed unbothered, but the tall guy had stalked toward his starting position with purpose, glaring at the split-haired boy. Izuku took the starting position the farthest away from the pair, wary of the tension crackling between them. That left the space beside Izuku to the girl that Izuku had spotted earlier in the hallway with Buzz. He had at least some idea of her quirk then, most likely be related if she was anything like her mentor. He would have thought about it some more, probably while trying to race ahead of the other participants if there hadn't been an explosion of cold air as soon as Present Mike called for them to start. Watching the trail of ice flow behind the split-haired boy and the way that the tall guy hovered through the air, it was easy to figure out what had happened. Izuku and Buzz's student stood in silence together as the pair of boys brute forced their way through the obstacle course. Then Buzz's student sighed and the sound of wing beats filled the air as she zipped after them, completely avoiding many of the obstacles. Izuku felt his heart sink, and then he took a step forward. It was bad luck to be paired with three extraordinary people, but it was also reality. Aizawa had told Izuku to do his best, and if he didn't at least live up to that expectation, then Izuku really would be the worst student. It was just a progress report. It wasn't like they were actually competing. Izuku just needed to get to the end of the course. That was all that really mattered here. He just needed to finish this, and then finish the next part, and then he will have kept his promise. The trail of ice was precise, mapping the split-haired boy's entire path across the obstacle course. A path that was the one of least resistance, and now the one that would be the hardest to take because of the layer of ice slowly melting there. Izuku began the course 5 seconds after the rest of his peers, and he began it with a jump that launched him just above the ice path onto the first angled platform. Izuku's way across the platforms was decidedly slower than anyone before him. Even while trying to concentrate, Izuku could feel a flush of embarrassment creeping up his cheeks. God. Present Mike and the three he was racing against were probably already at the finish waiting for Izuku to take his sweet time and catch up. The rope net was tangled up by the wind quirk that tall guy sported, so Izuku had to scale one of the pillars next to it instead, scurrying up as quickly as he could without any handholds. Izuku then had to face the monkey bars. The split-haired boy had glided on top of them and then made a ramp to coast down over the next obstacle. This was apparent because each rung was encased in ice. Izuku gritted his teeth and hesitantly reached out toward the first handhold. His position was precarious. His legs gripped the pillar. One arm served as an anchor to the pole while his fingertips stretched forward to brush against the ice. Izuku frowned as he gripped the first rung. The ice melted quickly under his hand. He would no doubt slip if he put all of his weight onto the bar, but the pillar he'd climbed goes up higher. He cautiously scooted farther up the pillar before he threw himself on top of the bars. Izuku didn't manage to twist enough midair to land elegantly, but there was enough force behind his leap that he did manage to get on top of the monkey bars. It was slow going with the ice, which was sturdy enough to maintain its shape but not cold enough to withstand the heat of Izuku's skin. It made it so that each time he touched the ice, water slicked his path, but it never melted enough for Izuku to actually get a solid grip. He eventually reached the end of the monkey bars, which at one point curved around so that the next obstacle was behind where the slanted platforms had been. Izuku knew, objectively, that it had not been too long since he started the obstacle course. He was making a perfectly respectable time even with the added challenge of the split-haired boy and the tall guy's quirks wrecking the course. But he was also last, and that made it easy for him to chance using the ice slope that split-haired boy had created to skip over the next two obstacles. Izuku barely kept his balance on the ice. His shoes worked against him, and at one point he was nearly sent flying when the GURPS caught on a chip in the ice. The next obstacle was a series of staggered hurdles that Izuku had to jump or duck under. Buzz's apprentice and the tall guy had most likely flown over this one. There was a gap between the ceiling and the tallest of the hurdles that would allow for them to pass through. The split-haired guy wasn't so lucky, Izuku thought as he weaved up and over the hurdles, sliding on the ice that covered the ground with each landing. Izuku couldn't imagine how much practice it must have taken the split-haired boy to be confident using ice as an aid for maneuverability. If he hesitated for even 1 second, then the ice would no longer be behind him, propelling him forward with its creation, but under his feet like it was Izuku's. The rest of the obstacle course was a bit of a blur for Izuku. There was a rock wall and a tightrope in a hall of moving blocks with a puddle of water on the ground from the melted walkway above it. Izuku reached the end though. He dodged out of the way of a swinging log and then broke into a dead sprint for the finish line where the rest of his group were waiting. Buzz's apprentice was chatting with Present Mike, and the split-haired boy and tall guy were standing a ways away from each other, glaring. The machine that Mike set up at the beginning let out a dull beep when Izuku sprinted past it. He had to zag around Buzz's student when she jerked around to look at him, and he ended the obstacle course a few feet away from the rest of the students after he lost momentum and couldn't come to a stop with his drenched shoes without risking a face plant into the packed dirt. Izuku clenched his fists and jerked his arms over his head, resting his forearms on the crown of his head, panting. The weight of his biceps against his ears elevated the sound of his blood rushing hot and fast in his veins. He didn't even glance at his time, just closed his eyes and tried to focus before he had to turn toward the people behind him. Someone clapped behind him, and Izuku instinctively turned, his eyes snapping open, his chest still heaving. "Great job, listeners," Present Mike cheered. "Let's head over to the waiting area, where you probably won't have to wait very long, but hopefully long enough that you can all catch your breath." The other kids gathered all seemed to glance at Izuku at the same time. He was the only one who needed any time at all to gather his breath. The split-haired boy looked away quickly. The tall guy stared, and Buzz's student directed her eyes toward her fingernails languidly, as if to say she was never looking in the first place. Her delicate chitin wings fluttered behind her. Izuku ducked his head and lowered his arms. He could feel a familiar heat creeping up his neck as the rest of the group caught up to his slightly forward position. Present Mike led the way, and Izuku naturally migrated to the back of the group, observing the individuals in front of him. Buzz's student tried to strike up a conversation with the split-haired boy and was brutally ignored. She then migrated over to the other boy, and they chatted until their group made it to the next building. Present Mike opened the door for all of them. Sometimes going into a building felt normal. You were walking through a door from the inside to the outside, one place to another place. Walking through this door felt like walking into another world. The outside was dusty and there were a multitude of footprints leading toward the building, but no set path. The inside was order personified, fluorescent lights and blue cushioned chairs. There were sneaker prints on the linoleum. Izuku was the last to walk in, and Present Mike gave him a thumbs up as he shuffled past. There were 16 other teens gathered in the room, talking nervously and sipping water out of those cone-shaped paper cups. There was a new-looking water dispenser in the corner of the room. None of it seemed permanent. The room would feel more natural if it was empty, not filled with anxious teenagers cradling paper cups that for some inhumane reason weren't allowed to be set down. Present Mike gestured toward the water, and something inside of Izuku twisted. The other three that were ahead of him had settled down into chairs, apparently not thirsty. The water was cold, and Izuku refilled his cup 2 times before he sat down in one of the chairs. The ponytail girl was next to him, and she gave him a kind, pitying smile. Present Mike gently shut the door behind him, then clapped his hands. Welcome to Phase 2, listeners. As soon as everyone quiets down, I will explain the rules for this section of the physical portion of the physical portion. Mike coughed. Everyone in the room who had been whispering to each other went silent. After that challenging course, someone scoffed. Izuku sunk down in his chair and tried not to blush more than he already was. We're gonna let you guys cool off with a little game. Shoulders relaxed and fingers lost their grips on crushed paper cups. That will be scored and counted toward your final results. Shoulders hunched. Mike pulled a Ziploc bag out of the pocket of his leather jacket and shook it. Small white pieces of paper rattled around inside. Each of you will get 3 of these cards. They all have either a circle or an X on them. Mike fumbled with the Ziploc and plucked out 2 cards, one with a circle and one with an X. You don't want the Zs. There are 5 of them in the whole deck, and if you have one by the end of the game, you'll lose points. Mike stuck the cards he had pulled out back into the bag and shook it violently. Cards will be given out randomly. There are only 3 rules. Don't start until I say to. No takesies backsies. And as long as everyone has 3 cards by the end of the game, everything will be hunky-dory. Mike went to the nearest person and handed them 3 cards, and then went to the next person and the next. Izuku watched their faces closely as they received their cards. One girl's eyebrow twitched. The person next to her brought a hand to their mouth and thought. A boy a few seats down slumped in his chair when he received his cards. Another girl grinned manically, but there was panic in her eyes. When it was Izuku's turn, he did not react beyond a small relieved smile. In his hands was, impossibly, 2 Zs and 1 circle. Izuku already knew who his best bet in getting circles would be. The relaxed boy in the corner with pointed teeth and gray hair. But how to talk him into a trade was the real question. If you had 3 circles from the beginning, there was really no reason to seek out a trade, so if anyone asked you to trade, it was common sense to assume they would have at least 1 X card that you didn't want, and you would refuse the trade. Izuku was mid-thought. When the last card was passed out, Present Mike barely managed to shout out begin, before the room suddenly exploded into an Arctic wasteland. Izuku immediately jerked his feet away from the ground, avoiding the frost that trapped the feet of the people on either side of him. Ponytail girl already had an ice pick in her hand that she had produced from nowhere, but the person on Izuku's other side was just staring at their feet in shock. Izuku whipped his head toward where he had last seen the split-haired boy, and was rather alarmed to see him moving directly toward Izuku, a determined glint in his dual-colored eyes. Izuku decided what he was going to do within the few seconds that it took the split-haired boy to stalk across the ice toward him. His feet were already up, so all he had to do was adjust his weight to get them underneath him, and then he launched himself forward, landing in a roll and sliding forward on the slick terrain, bumping against the shins of students still trapped in their ice prisons. Izuku scrambled up, using one of the stranger's legs as a handhold and immediately feeling bad about it, moving farther away from his pursuer. A spike of ice erected itself in Izuku's path, and he could have moved around it, used it as a handhold to change his momentum, broken off the spike top to use as a makeshift weapon. But that wasn't the optimal move. The optimal move was to get caught, so Izuku panicked and spun around, his cards clenched in one hand that he held against his chest. It was only after the split-haired boy's deft fingers worked the scraps of paper out of Izuku's grip and slapped his own cards into Izuku's hand that a sly grin crept its way across Izuku's face. Izuku had 2 of the X cards. The slumped boy had one, the girl with the manic smile had one, and the split-haired boy must have had the last, making this trade a net gain for Izuku. And what? Split-haired boy said placidly, like he hadn't just trapped Izuku against an icicle after chasing him across the room. When he spoke, his breath condensed in the air, a puff of white breath escaping toward the ceiling. You smiled, he said. Despite the way his expression had barely changed, there was anger boiling under his words. They simmered. Izuku was very used to words with heat. I did. Present Mike shouted. You have 5 minutes left. Split-haired boy made a noise that was adjacent to a growl, and then he turned on his heel and stalked toward other prey. Izuku still had 1 X card. He now understood why what he had initially assumed would be a trading game was a part of the physical portion. Clearly, the Zs had made their way into different hands. Buzz's student was flitting around the room, looking over people's shoulders and trying to snatch their cards. A boy with horns was fighting off another student who was shooting something out of their fingertips. Izuku just needed 1 more circle card. If he picked 1 card out of the room at random, there was a very low probability that he would get an X, especially with the time limit pressing down onto the crowd, revealing the desperate. For a progress report type of thing, some of these people were taking it awfully seriously. There was no rule saying you had to take all 3 of someone's cards. As the clock ticked down, Izuku watched Present Mike. When he opened his mouth to speak, Izuku snapped his hand out and swapped cards with a boy who had settled just a little too close to him. By the time the boy had turned to look at Izuku with an aghast expression, Present Mike had already announced the end of the game. That was quite underhanded, the boy said, pushing his glasses up his nose with 1 finger. Izuku's eyes flickered down. Silver pipes and specialized running shoes greeted him. Izuku forced a bashful smile. He didn't know what to say. I'm sorry, he ended up replying. As you should be. A hero should never take advantage of people. The public trusts them with their lives. Ada made a sort of chopping motion with his hand to punctuate his sentence. If you just go around using unhonorable tactics, Ada cut himself off, shaking his head and looking down his nose at Izuku, like he was too disgusted to continue, or wasn't going to bother with someone as lowly as Izuku. Izuku put a scolded expression on and broke eye contact. You're right, trustworthiness is an important aspect of heroism. Ada opened his mouth to say something else, but was interrupted by Present Mike telling them where to proceed for the next part. Izuku speed walked with the rest of the crowd so that he was soundly in the middle, leaving Ada behind him. Anxiety gnawed at Izuku, its pointed teeth sinking into his fingertips and toes, small stabs of restlessness around him. The other students morphed into blurs of color and sound that obscured his vision. Izuku can vaguely remember Present Mike directing them all back toward the main campus and sitting in a waiting room while people get called out to tie up some loose ends and sign some paperwork. Izuku was the last person in the waiting room. When someone wandered in, she had a confused look on her face, eyebrows furrowed and lip held in a death grip as she glanced around nervously. At first, Izuku thought that she was one of the students, returned to the waiting room for a forgotten item. But her lack of athletic clothing makes him reconsider. She was wearing a pencil skirt and gripping a binder close to her chest so filled with papers it looked like it might burst. Izuku tried not to stare. He didn't want to make her more uncomfortable than she already was. He kept his eyes on his shoes and picked at the remnants of the red nail polish clinging to his cuticles. The girl's heeled shoes clicked across the linoleum, the sound gradually getting louder as she crossed the room and then stopped. Izuku looked up in time to watch her push her glasses up her nose and then flail to catch some papers that started to slide out of her arm. She righted herself and teetered for a second before she steadied. Do you know where the business department is? I need to submit my marketing plan for the business course recommendation exam. Izuku's fingers slipped off of each other and his fingertips skidded across his hands. I think I saw a sign, Izuku recalled, trying to picture the fuzzy route that his group had taken to get to the waiting room. Really? The girl said, adjusting the papers in her arms. Would you mind showing me? I'm supposed to be there within the next, 15 minutes. I can't afford to get lost again. Izuku glanced around the room nervously. Could he leave and show the girl to the business course before he was needed to sign paperwork? He looked at the clock and then back at the girl struggling with her papers and shifting around uncomfortably in her heels and tights. Sure I have time, I think. Izuku stood. Do you want help carrying some of those papers? Oh, absolutely, the girl sighed, practically shoving the binder into Izuku's hands. I'm Ashikaga Junko. Midoriya Izuku. Good. Ashikaga made an aborted attempt to tuck her hair behind her ear but then stopped halfway through. Suo, what are you doing here? Oh, well, I'm doing a kind of progress check thing. I'm not really sure, honestly. My sensei said it would be a good way to see where I need to improve and measure myself against other people training under heroes. Izuku explained. Ew, how cool. What hero are you training under? Are you going to go to school here? Do you have any plans for your image? Ashikaga rapid-fired questions at him. Oh, I'm training under the underground hero Eraserhead. I don't think I'm going to go to school here. And my friends have suggested a few things, but I'm honestly not sure if I even need to worry about my image since I'm planning on going underground. They came across a fork in the hallway they were going down and Izuku instinctually went left. Oh, what a shame, Ashikaga said. She speed-walked in front of Izuku and turned around to walk backward, giving him an up and down. You could really rock the innocent protector archetype. She tilted her head and squinted at him. Or maybe a young idol type thing if you cleaned up a little bit. Izuku flushed. Ashikaga slowed down and turned back around to walk beside him. Sorry. It's a business student habit, or excuse me, my habit as a business course hopeful. Ashikaga gave him a rueful smile. Izuku gave a wobbly one back. Oh, here's the sign, Izuku said, bringing her attention to the directions in front of them. The sign seemed purposefully confusing with a series of arrows next to each department in different colors. Ashikaga hummed. This seems like the kind of place you just have to know well to get around. Humor danced in her gray eyes. Yeah, Izuku agreed wearily, memorizing the directions the arrows pointed and then starting forward. I'm sure we'll make it to your turn in on time though, don't worry. Ashikaga jolted. A fingertip fluttered briefly near her temple before she followed. Oh, of course, thanks again. Why don't you think you're going to go to school here? She asked. Izuku paused, tried to figure out how to explain things to a stranger, and started again. It just feels like I wouldn't belong, I guess. But if you're going to be a hero, this is the best place to do it. Why do you want to be a hero anyway? Ashikaga seemed to frown at herself for a brief moment before focusing back on Izuku. Izuku took a left turn that turned out to be a loop-de-loop. I guess that's true. I want to be a hero for the same reason everyone does, to help people. Izuku shrugged and laughed nervously, falling silent for a few moments. Ashikaga hummed. Her eyes focused on Izuku's face even as she walked steadily next to him. The sound echoed in the empty corridors. And why help people? What do you really get out of it? What? Izuku tilted his head, slowing his pace through the halls. What do you mean? Ashikaga waved her hands in the air. Oh, come on, I mean everyone wants to help people, right? Or they say they do, but everyone has an ulterior motive. It doesn't make us bad, it just makes us human. You can tell me Midoriya-san, I won't judge you. I really do just want to help people. Izuku's mouth moved almost without his permission, but I guess it would be nice to prove that I'm capable of helping people, that I'm not useless. As soon as the words fell from his tongue, Izuku snapped his mouth closed with an audible click. Embarrassment bloomed in him swiftly, filling his chest with hot regret that bubbled and spilled over, coating his ribs in discomfort. And you believe that our current heroic infrastructure can actually help you do that? Ashikaga continued unerringly. Yes, Izuku continued, lips numb, despite the corruption within the Hero Commission and other entities that stand to profit from the heroic business. At the end of the day, all heroes are required to help people. Even if they do it for the wrong reasons or if they don't do it as well as they should, disasters are always going to happen, and the more people there are that are even slightly capable of helping, the better. As long as heroes are still functionally heroes and do more good than bad, yeah, I think it's a system that I can use. Ashikaga had a nosebleed. Are you okay? Izuku yelped, coming back to himself. His fingertips tingled. What? Yeah, I'm fine. Why? You have a nosebleed, Izuku spluttered. He juggled the papers in his hands. Ashikaga's chuckle interrupted Izuku's panic. She had pulled a dark handkerchief out of a pocket on her blazer and was lightly dabbing away the small amount of blood with one hand, the other wedged under her glasses so that she could pinch the bridge of her nose. No, don't worry. It's just a side effect of my quirk. Oh, Izuku's mind raced. A passive effect? That's not important right now, Ashikaga said, almost absent-mindedly. Izuku's thoughts slowed. He looked at Ashikaga. Not a passive effect. Then you were just using it on me. Izuku couldn't help but feel slightly betrayed. Ashikaga stiffened, her voice moving away from her normal cadence towards something harsh and cold and indifferent. It's not a big deal. I'm sure that you use your quirk all the time. Everyone does it. Just because mine is a mental quirk doesn't make it any more morally wrong. Izuku kept quiet, sensing danger, and so he changed the topic. What made you want to go into heroic business management? Oh well, Ashikaga trailed off the ice and her voice melting as she convinced herself that Izuku wasn't going to press. I went into business because I think that how you present yourself is everything. Anything you say can and will impact how civilians and villains see you. Flashy, dark, intimidating, sweet. How you choose to present yourself opens thousands of doors for you. It's by far the most interesting aspect of having such prominent public crime-fighting figures. Izuku forcefully brightened, glad to see the conversation turning away from serious topics. He nodded encouragingly. I agree. Present Mike's agency Center Stage is a really good example of that, I think. Ashikaga grinned at him, and they were back to the mood from the beginning of their conversation. The only evidence that something off had occurred was the smudge of red above Ashikaga's lip. Exactly, Midoriya-san. Center Stage is such they make me go feral. The fact that they're ranked like what? Fifth in Japan for successful undercover operations when all of their heroes have distinctly recognizable appearances and SH ticks. That's the power of a symbol. If everyone knows what present Mike looks like, then no one knows what he looks like when he's not all suited up for a performance. Yeah, Izuku rushed to agree, absent-mindedly taking the next turn on the path to the business department. Expectations are something that you can really play with in the heroic field. My Izuku pause. My friends Mei and Nishia have both been bugging me about what I might want to do for my hero costume, and I haven't gotten back to them because there are just so many approaches I could take. I don't want to go too simple and then be scared to build up, but I also don't want to start out too strong and commit to a bit that ends up wrong for the type of hero I become. Ashikaga nodded, a finger pressed to her lips in thought. Honestly, that's a problem a lot of first years don't even consider when turning in their costumes, so you're on the right track. If you go to UA, the costume designs, or I heard that the costume designs go through the business department first, so you could potentially request a meeting with your Ashikaga's words dissolved into mumbling. Well, they're usually randomly assigned to first years, and they just go for the most obvious thematic match possible based off what's requested and a quirk description, but clearly you've put more thought into this than most first years, so maybe we could get you a second year and then Izuku watched, confusion evident in his expression as Ashikaga jolted and then slapped a hand over her mouth. Sorry about that. I really got us off topic for a second. That stuff really isn't relevant. An almost panicked laugh left Ashikaga's mouth. Really, look at me just going on and on. What, oh god, we're already here. Izuku looked around. The doors around them clearly labeled as business course classrooms. I should probably go back to the waiting room. Apparently there's some paperwork I need to sign and I wouldn't want to keep them waiting. It was nice talking to you. Here's your papers and stuff. Ashikaga Junko took the papers clumsily transferred over to her numbly, looking into the middle distance. Bye. Izuku waved meekly before jogging back the way he had come. Well, that was a bit of a letdown, Ashikaga-san. Nedzu's voice in Junko's ear was bright and happy as it always was. Junko scrambled to press a hand against her earpiece and activate the two-way channel. I'm so sorry, Nedzu-san. It was honestly so much harder to work the questions you gave me into the conversation than I thought it would be, and he was much more reserved than I expected for a hero hopeful. Not to worry, Ashikaga-san. I got a suitable amount of information from your conversation for my purposes. All the blanks will hopefully be filled in by my other sources. Nedzu cut her off. Oh, Junko bit her lip. So am I still getting that extra credit, or? You will still receive the extra credit points on your summer project as we discussed. Nedzu confirmed. Wonderful. And while I have you on the line, sir, do you think that if that kid decides to go here that Junko could feel herself getting ramped up, excited at the prospect of working with a hero student who actually cared about the marketing implications of their costume, and maybe also at explaining herself to the kid because he seemed nice and she didn't want him going around thinking that she just used her quirk on people willy-nilly because she didn't, and even if she did, it wasn't like Midoriya Izuku's application, and all subsequent forms connected to said application will be going through the regular official channels. Nedzu interrupted her and her speeding thoughts. Several parties have an unbiased stake in Midoriya-san's future, so I think it would be best if you hold off any interests until his place at UA has fully settled, Ashikaga-san. All right, sir, Junko said glumly. Izuku signed some paperwork and went home.